Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Today, we're venturing deep into the heart of Texas, where the highways fade into nothing, the buildings crumble into dust, and every abandoned town has a story it would rather keep buried. These aren't just places left behind, they're scars in the land, haunted by the people, tragedies, and whispers they can't quite let go of, from phantom miners coughing in the desert wind to whole towns swallowed by hurricanes and never seen again. These are 21 true Texas ghost towns with dark histories, stories that blur the line between history and horror. But here's the thing, most people make one big mistake. They leave without subscribing. And when they do, they miss the creepiest, most spine-chilling stories you'll ever hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the darkness we're about to step into doesn't let everyone come back. That's so. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. Because here, the night is only getting started, and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now, let's begin our journey through the ghost towns of Texas. I drove into Terlingua on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of day when the air feels dry enough to crack your skin and the sun sits heavy in the sky without a cloud to soften it. My phone read 87 degrees, but there was no breeze. And the desert has a way of making you feel like you're walking into an oven no matter what the thermometer says. The highway leading in was a ribbon of pale asphalt, curling through a landscape of dust, rock, and brittle tufts of grass that looked like they hadn't seen rain in months. I'd taken a week off work to do a solo road trip across West Texas. I had a list of stops, abandoned places, roadside diners, quiet desert towns, and Terlingua was just supposed to be a curiosity. I'd read about it online, an old mercury mining town that had been half abandoned for decades, now a strange mix of ruins, artists, and drifters. I figured I'd grab lunch at the Starlight Theater, maybe take some photos of the old cemetery, and move on before dark. When I pulled into the town's main dirt lot, it was mostly empty except for a few dusty trucks and a rusted Jeep with New Mexico plates. The Starlight Theater was closed until evening, so I wandered toward the cemetery, which was up a short hill. The path was littered with shards of broken glass and pale bones, probably animal, but small enough to make me keep looking over my shoulder. The Terlingua Cemetery wasn't like the ones back home. The graves were crude mounds of dirt, each marked with rough wooden crosses or hand-painted stones. Many were decorated with faded artificial flowers, tequila bottles, or old photographs sealed in cloudy plastic. Some graves had crumbled entirely, revealing pale ribs of stonework beneath. It was quiet, so quiet that my own breathing sounded too loud. I remember the smell most of all. It wasn't rot, not exactly. More like dust baked into something metallic, almost like the tang of pennies on your tongue. That was when I saw the first man. He was standing by one of the graves near the back, where the ground sloped toward a dry wash. He wore a long brown coat despite the heat, and a battered wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He was facing away from me, one hand resting on the crooked cross in front of him. I almost called out a greeting, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly, just a feeling that I shouldn't interrupt. I turned my attention back to the graves, taking a few photos. When I glanced back toward where the man had been, he was gone. The ground there was open and flat, no trees or walls to duck behind. I figured he must have headed down into the wash, though I hadn't heard footsteps. I decided I'd had enough of the cemetery. On the way back toward my car, I passed a small cluster of adobe ruins. The largest one still had part of its roof intact, and in the shade of the doorway, I noticed something strange, an old metal pail with a cracked enamel basin beside it. Inside the basin was a dark, reddish stain, dry and flaking. I told myself it was rust, but my stomach tightened anyway. I got back in my car and drove toward the ghost town ruins near the mining area. The dirt road narrowed and twisted, and my tires kicked up plumes of dust that hung in the air like smoke. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting the desert in a harsher light. The old mining structures rose ahead, skeletons of wood and rusted tin clinging to the rock as I parked. I heard it. A deep, hacking cough. It was faint at first, almost lost in the sigh of the wind, but it grew louder, closer. I scanned the hillside, expecting to see someone stepping out from behind one of the leaning shacks. No one appeared. The coughing stopped, replaced by a strange rasping breath that made my scalp prickle. I told myself it was an echo, sound bouncing off the dry hills. But when I turned to get back into my car, there was a figure standing about 20 yards away, half hidden by a slant of corrugated metal. He wore that same long brown coat and wide-brimmed hat. This time, his head was tilted toward me, though the shadow from the hat's brim kept his face in darkness. I called out, "Hey, are you all right?" The figure didn't move. The wind picked up, and for a moment I could have sworn I smelled something sharp and metallic again, stronger this time, like blood left in the sun. I didn't wait for an answer. I got into my car, started the engine, and pulled away, my hands tied on the wheel. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man take a single step forward before the dust cloud swallowed him. I drove back toward the main road, heart pounding. By the time I reached the tiny gas station on the edge of town, I convinced myself it was just a local, maybe a prospector or someone living rough in the desert. I stopped to get gas, and as I paid, I mentioned to the clerk that I'd seen someone out near the old mine. She stopped counting my change. Her eyes flicked up to mine, then toward the window. What did he look like? I told her. Brown coat, wide-brimmed hat. Didn't say much. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "You're not the first to see him. Folks around here say it's one of the old miners. Cinnabar poisoning will turn your skin red, rot your lungs. Some of them never left." I tried to laugh it off, but it came out thin. "A ghost story, huh?" She slid my change across the counter. "Just don't go back out there after dark." I left Terlingua an hour later, heading east toward Alpine. The sky was turning that deep indigo you only see in the desert, with the last light bleeding out behind the mountains. I drove with the windows down, trying to shake the unease, when I heard it again. A cough. This time it came from the back seat. I didn't stop the car. I didn't look. I just drove faster, the desert rushing by in the dark, the cough fading into the sound of the wind. I haven't been back to Terlingua since. I was driving west through Reeves County in late February of 2019, the kind of winter night where the air feels brittle and the wind carries that dry, metallic tang of desert dust. It was about 8:30 p.m., and I was on US 80, heading toward El Paso after visiting my brother in Odessa. The sun had dropped behind the Guadalupe Mountains hours ago, and the last streaks of orange had bled into an endless, moonlit plain. My phone was sitting in the cup holder, GPS still active, but there hadn't been a service bar for at least 40 minutes. The road was quiet except for the occasional shimmer of headlights far behind me, fading almost as soon as I noticed them. That I wasn't planning on stopping until Van Horn, but my gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and I'd been holding out for a station that didn't look like it had been abandoned for decades. That's when I saw a green highway sign half buried in sand that read, "Toya, 2 miles." I didn't know much about Toya beyond the fact that it used to be a railroad hub a century ago and now was more of a ghost town. Still, I figured they might have one functioning pump, maybe a bathroom. The turnoff was easy to miss. It curved, away from the highway under a broken street lamp that swayed in the wind. The asphalt cracked into patches of dirt and faded paint lines, and as I rolled into town, I noticed there were no actual streetlights working. The only illumination came from the cold wash of my headlights and the moon above. Rows of buildings hunched on either side of the road, their windows either boarded up or shattered inward. The kind of place where the wind doesn't just blow, it seeps. That I slowed down when I saw a small store with a lit neon sign that flickered between open and pen. Relief hit me, but when I pulled up, the pump was the old manual kind, with a faded Texaco logo. The glass on the dial was clouded, and the numbers were frozen mid-roll. The store's windows were dark except for a faint, warm glow in the back. I knocked on the locked glass door, but no one came. That's when I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, almost hidden under the wind, but once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. A low, rhythmic whistling. Not the random pitch changes you get from a breeze cutting through alleyways, but steady, timed, like someone standing just out of sight, blowing a single note in perfect intervals. For seconds on, 2 seconds, off, over and over. It made my scalp prickle. I told myself it was just the wind moving through some old pipes, but it followed me as I walked around the store to check for a side door. The moment I stepped into the alley, the sound got clearer. It was coming from the direction of a squat brick building across the street, an old schoolhouse with its roof half collapsed. The place looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1930s. The bricks faded to a pale pink, windows missing entirely. There was something else, too. A smell. Damp wood mixed with something sweeter, almost like overripe fruit. It didn't belong in a place this dry. I told myself to get back in the car, but instead I found myself crossing the street. The whistling never broke its rhythm, but it grew louder as I approached the schoolhouse. When I reached the front steps, I could see inside through the broken doorway. The moonlight fell across warped floorboards and a long row of what I first thought were benches, but when my eyes adjusted, I realized they were old desks. Some still had papers inside, yellow and curling, and in the far back, by the collapsed section of the roof, stood a single figure that I couldn't make out their face. They were turned slightly away, but I could see they were wearing what looked like a black conductor's coat. Their posture was stiff, both hands at their sides, and their head tilted just enough that I could see the shape of their mouth. It was puckered, whistling the exact same note, never pausing to breathe. My chest tightened. I stepped back and my shoe crunched on broken glass. The whistling stopped. The figure's head rotated toward me, slow and deliberate, but the shadows from the collapsed roof masked every feature above the mouth. The lips didn't move, but I heard the whistle again, sharper now, as if it was right beside my ear. That was enough. I bolted for the car, not looking back until I was inside with the doors locked. The road out of Toya felt longer than it had going in. My headlights caught glimpses of buildings I hadn't noticed before, a boarded-up diner, a row of houses with curtains swaying in open windows. And at every turn, I swore I saw shapes just at the edge of the light. Not moving, just standing up. The time I reached the highway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. I didn't stop until Van Horn, and when I got out to pump gas, my knees almost gave. My phone buzzed with notifications as service came back, but one stood out immediately. It was a voice memo. No sender name, just a timestamp from 30 minutes earlier. I didn't remember making it. When I pressed play, all I heard was that same steady whistling. For seconds on, 2 seconds off. And underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a train approaching. But there hasn't been a working train line through Toya in decades. I had never even heard of Lobo, Texas, until I drove past it by accident last October. It was a little after 4 p.m. on a Thursday. The air was that dry, brittle kind of autumn heat you only get in West Texas, the kind that tastes faintly like dust. I was headed west on Highway 90 from Van Horn toward El Paso for a work delivery, just trying to shave time off my route before sunset. The sky was so big and clean it looked painted, but the wind was dead still. My GPS had glitched an hour earlier. Cell service was patchy out here, so I was navigating off memory and road signs. That's probably why I didn't realize I'd drifted onto a frontage road that eventually turned into cracked pavement, then gravel, then something you couldn't quite call a road anymore, that I saw the Lobo sign when I slowed down to figure out where I'd gone wrong. It wasn't a proper welcome sign, just a dented green marker with white letters, leaning to one side like it wanted to fall. Past it, there were maybe a dozen buildings spread out like they'd been shaken from a box and left where they landed. Most were single-story stucco or weathered clapboard, all bleached gray by the sun. There were no cars, no people, not even a stray dog sniffing around. I rolled down my window expecting to hear wind through dry grass, maybe cicadas. Nothing. Just the low hum of my own engine I'd heard before that abandoned towns get quiet. But this was different. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind that presses against your ears until you start to hear your own blood moving. I parked on what used to be a main street, I guess. The asphalt was split open with pale weeds pushing through. A faded grocery store stood on one corner, its plate glass gone, door propped open. Across from it, a line of shuttered storefronts slumped in the shade of a warped awning that at first I told myself I'd only get out for a minute. Just a quick look. I'm the type who can't pass up a roadside oddity. I stepped onto the street and felt how the ground seemed to hold heat from earlier in the day, radiating up through my shoes. There was a faint smell, like when you open an old shed after it's been shut all summer. Dry rot and stale wood. The town's layout was simple. Main Street ran a few hundred yards before curving into a cluster of houses. Beyond that, I saw the remains of what looked like an old reservoir. The concrete walls were still there, streaked with rust and algae stains, but the inside was just cracked dirt and wind-blown trashed. That's when I heard it was so soft at first, I thought it was a truck far off on the highway. But it had a rhythm. Splash. Pause. Splash. It sounded exactly like someone dropping a heavy object into water. Only there was no water here. I stood still for a while, just listening. The noise would stop for maybe 30 seconds, then start. Again, always from the same direction, somewhere in the middle of that bone-dry basin. I told myself it could be a loose metal sheet in the wind, or maybe an animal moving around. But I hadn't seen a single bird or insect since I'd gotten out of the truck. Not one. I called out, just a simple hello. And my voice came back to me, so clearly it made me jump. No one answered. The splashing didn't stop. I started walking toward the reservoir. Gravel crunched under my boots. With every step the air felt warmer, like I was walking into a heat pocket. The smell got stranger too, almost like wet earth, even though there hadn't been rain in weeks. When I reached the rim, I looked down into the basin. Nothing, just cracked mud and weeds. The splashing had stopped. I stood there a long moment, shading my eyes from the low sun. That's when I saw movement on the far side, just a flicker, like someone ducking out of view behind one of the old water pumps. My stomach tightened. I almost called out again, but something about the way the shadow had moved didn't feel right. Too quick. I decided I'd had enough sightseeing. I turned back toward my truck, but as I walked, I heard it again. This time it was louder, faster. Splash, splash, splash. I turned, and my mouth went dry. There was still nothing in the basin. But now the sound wasn't coming from a single point. It was echoing from all around me, like the empty concrete itself was making it. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. I didn't run, but I walked faster than I probably ever have without calling it a run. When I got back to the truck, I noticed something that made my skin crawl worse than the sound had. My tire tracks on the dusty street were gone. The thin layer of grit I'd driven over looked undisturbed, like I hadn't driven there at all. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I backed up to turn around, I glanced toward the reservoir. I could see the far wall from here, and I swear there was something standing at the edge. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was tall, taller than a person, and thin in a way that made me think of the metal windmills you see out here, only without the blades. It didn't move. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I found my way back to Highway 90 and drove straight into Van Horn without stopping. By the time I got there, the sun had dipped behind the mountains and the sky was bleeding out. Its last light. That night at the motel, I looked up Lobo out of curiosity. Wikipedia said it was abandoned in the early 1990s when water rights dried up. A few scattered mentions on travel blogs described it as eerily still and great for photography. But on one old forum, I found something else, a post from 2004, from a guy who said he'd camped near the reservoir and heard splashing all night. He left before dawn and never went back. I shut my laptop and told myself it was just some trick of sound, maybe heat warping the air. But I keep thinking about those missing tire tracks. And how, when I left, I never actually saw a road sign pointing me back to Highway 90. I just drove until I was there, like the town had let me go. I've taken that route for work twice since then. I make sure I stay on the main road. But every time I pass that stretch of desert, I feel the urge to slow down and look for that leaning green sign. I never do. But sometimes, when it's dead quiet in the cab, I think I hear it again. Splash. Pause. Splash. And I know there's no water for hundreds of miles. I've lived in South Texas my entire life, and I know that stretch of Highway 83 between Laredo and Carrizo Springs better than I'd like to. There's not much out there but dry grass, mesquite, and rusted oil rigs leaning like skeletons toward the sun. Most people don't even notice the turn-off for Catarina anymore. If you do, you'll see a faded sign with flaking white letters and an arrow pointing east, but the arrow is bent toward the ground. It was January of last year, late afternoon, just after a cold front had blown in. The wind was sharp enough to sting through my jacket, but the air had that rare clean smell you only get here after a rain. I was driving from Laredo to Eagle Pass for work and decided to take the back roads to avoid a wreck I'd heard about on the main highway. That's how I ended up on FM 133, which runs right past Katerina. The sun was low and throwing long shadows. Across the fields, the land was flat and open, but off in the distance, you could see the remains of old pump jacks, their silhouettes twitching slightly in the wind like something still trying to move after it's died. I passed maybe 3 houses in 20 minutes, all with boarded-up windows or collapsed roofs. The town itself wasn't even a proper town anymore. Just a scattering of abandoned buildings, a burned-out gas station, and a 2-room post office that still somehow gets mail once a week that I'd read about Katerina before. Oil boomed there in the 1920s, and when it dried up, everyone left. But there was something else I remembered, a story buried in an old article about Dimmitt County folklore. In 1942, a group of workers digging a foundation hit a pit full of human bones. No markers, no coffins, just a tangled mass of skeletons. The county supposedly sealed it back up and built over it, and no official record was ever kept. Locals said that at night, the ground in that patch of earth would stay warm. Even in the middle of winter, that I wasn't thinking about that story until I saw that IT was just past the edge of town, a flat stretch of dirt surrounded by a low, sagging fence. There was nothing growing there, not even weeds, just bare soil, the color of dried blood. A warped wooden post held up a faded "No trespassing" sign, but the letters had been chewed away by sun and time. That's when my truck's check engine light came on, and the dashboard gave a short beep. I cursed under my breath and coasted to the side of the road. There was no one else around, no sound except the wind hissing through the dry grass. I popped the hood and stood there, looking at the engine like it might suddenly tell me what was wrong. The wind shifted. It was subtle, but it brought a smell with it. Not gas, not oil, but something faintly metallic and sour, like old blood on a penny. It was strong enough to make me swallow hard. "Hello." The voice startled me. I turned, expecting to see someone coming down the road, but the asphalt was empty. The voice hadn't been loud, just a soft question, close enough that I felt certain. It had come from inside the fence. That I told myself it was just the wind in the fence wire, a trick of the air. I kept working under the hood, or at least pretending to. The smell got stronger, and now I could hear a slow, rhythmic sound, like someone pushing their hands through loose dirt, then letting it fall. That I stepped around the truck to get a better look at the fenced-off patch. The light was getting thin now, the horizon turning orange and purple. The soil inside the fence looked darker, as if it had been freshly turned, but there were no footprints. I could see faint steam rising from it in the cold air, tiny ghostly trails twisting upward before disappearing. That I heard the dirt sound again, followed by a soft, wet thump. The voice came again, barely above a whisper. "It's warm." I froze. My skin prickled from my neck down to my arms. This time I was sure it had come from right behind the fence, but I couldn't see anyone. I backed toward the driver's door. The truck started on the first try, even though I hadn't fixed a thing. As I put it in gear, something caught my eye in the side mirror. A figure was standing just inside the fence line. I only saw them for a second before the truck lurched forward, but they were tall and impossibly thin, wearing something dark and loose that moved in the wind. The head seemed tilted too far to one side, and I think, though I can't be certain, the mouth was moving, like they were still speaking. I drove out of Katerina faster than I should have, not stopping until I hit the main highway again. That night, I called a friend who's lived in Carrizo Springs his whole life and told him what I'd seen. He went quiet for a long time, then said, "Don't ever stop there again. People go missing out that way. Cops don't even bother looking anymore." I asked if he believed in the story about the warm ground. He said, "It's not just the ground, it's who's under it." Then he hung up. The next morning, I checked my truck in the daylight. Nothing was wrong with it. The check engine light was gone, as if it had never been on. But when I opened the hood, there was a thin line of reddish dirt packed into the seam where the hood meets the body. I live 50 miles from Katerina, and the dirt out here is pale gray, almost white. I brushed it off into my hand. It was warm, and as I let it run between my fingers, I swear I heard someone whisper, almost against my ear, "It's warm." Founded in hope, gutted by drought. That's what the faded sign says on the way into Barstow, Texas. Below it, the town motto is barely legible. "Our future runs on water." Funny thing is, There hasn't been running water here in decades. The Pecos River dried to a trickle after the droughts in the 70s, and the irrigation canal that once kept the town alive is now just a long scar in the dirt, stretching through the outskirts like a concrete coffin that I grew up 2 towns over in. Monaghan's, and I only ended up in Barstow because my cousin David lives there. He's one of those guys who works night shifts in oilfield security and spends his days sleeping, so the few times I visit, I mostly just kill time wandering around. In late September of last year, I stayed over for a weekend. I got there on a Friday evening, around 6:30 p.m., just as the sun was slipping down, staining the clouds orange and purple. The heat was still heavy, close to 95 degrees, but the air had that dry, dusty smell that only West Texas evenings have, David told me. I could take his old mountain bike if I wanted to check out the town. Just don't go near the canal at night, he said casually, pulling on his work boots that I asked him why. But he just shook his head. Kids in town have stories. Weird ones. Not worth finding out if they're true. He left before I could press him on it. The canal wasn't hard to find. Even in its dried-up state, it cuts across the landscape like a forgotten highway. Its walls are sloped concrete, cracked and graffiti-tagged, with patches of weeds poking through. I walked my bike along the edge for a while. The only sounds the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the distant whine of a semi on Highway 80. I'm not a superstitious person, but there was something strange about how quiet it felt down there. No bugs chirping, no wind in the weeds. Just heat radiating off the cement and a faint smell like wet clay, which made no sense because there was no water anywhere. The first odd thing happened as I was heading back. About 20 yards down the canal, I saw a dark patch on the concrete. I thought it was oil or maybe a shadow from the fence above, but when I looked again, it was gone. I figured it was just the light playing tricks as the sun dipped lower. That night, around 11 p.m., David still wasn't home. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to walk to the corner store for a soda. The quickest way was to cut down the path. Beside the canal, it was cooler now, the air smelling faintly of creosote from the power poles. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting sharp shadows. Halfway down the path, I stopped. There was a sound coming from the canal below, faint but clear. It was a dripping noise. At first I thought it was water from a pipe, but the canal was dry. I crouched at the edge and peered down. The concrete was dark in patches again, and something in the deepest part of the channel was reflecting the moonlight. I stayed there, listening. The drips were irregular, like something wet shifting in place. I was leaning forward when I heard the faintest splash, so soft I thought I imagined it. Then something else, like a slow inhale through water. I backed away fast and didn't look down again. The next day, I told David about it. He sighed and told me the story everyone in town had heard. Back in the 50s, before the drought, a boy drowned in the canal during a summer flood. The current pinned him against a sluice gate, and they didn't recover him for 2 days. His parents moved away after that, and people claimed to see wet footprints on the canal path at night. Kids dared each other to walk the canal bed in the dark, and those who tried said they felt hands grabbing their ankles. I laughed it off, but David wasn't joking. I've worked enough nights near that canal to know something's off. He said, you'll be walking along and swear you hear someone right behind you, but when you turn, there's nothing. And that smell, you'll know it. Wet clay. That evening I sat on his porch while he napped before his shift. Around 8 p.m., a group of neighborhood kids rode by on bikes. One of them, a skinny kid with a busted baseball cap, slowed down and asked if I'd been to the canal yet. I said I had. He grinned and said, bet you won't walk it tonight. Something in his tone felt less like a dare and more like a warning wrapped as a joke. I didn't answer, but later that night, against my better judgment, I went back. It was after midnight. The air had cooled to maybe 78 degrees. A thin layer of clouds blurred the moonlight, making everything look flat and colorless. I climbed down into the canal at one of the old maintenance ladders. The metal rungs were rough with rust, and the walls felt colder than they should have. Walking along the canal bed was like being in a trench. The air was heavier down there, damp somehow. My footsteps echoed, and every few seconds I caught that smell, wet clay. About 50 yards in, I heard it again, dripping. This time it was louder, coming from around a bend. My pulse was hammering in my ears, but I kept moving. I rounded the bend and froze. The concrete ahead was slick and black, like it had just rained there and nowhere else. In the middle of it was a shallow pool of water, maybe 3 feet across. Something was disturbing the surface, sending tiny ripples outward. I took a step closer, and the ripples stopped. Then I felt it. Something cold brushed against my ankle. I jumped back, heart in my throat. There was nothing there. The pool was still. I started backing away, eyes locked on the water. That's when I saw the hand. It was pale, bloated, with skin like wax. It broke the surface slowly, fingers splayed, dripping water onto the concrete. The wrist disappeared into the pool, as if the water went deeper than the canal itself. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway up the ladder. When I risked a glance back, the pool was gone. Just dry, cracked concrete. I haven't been back to Barstow since. But 2 nights ago, I woke up to the sound of dripping outside my apartment window. The air smelled like wet clay. I was in Llano County, Texas, in late September of 2022. It had been a rough summer, triple-digit heat for weeks, barely any rain. Lake Buchanan was lower than I had ever seen it, the shoreline receding hundreds of feet from the usual waterline. Locals said it was the worst drought since the 50s. I'd been staying in a little rental cabin just north of Buchanan Dam, trying to get some quiet after a particularly ugly breakup. The cabin was nothing special, but the porch faced west over the lake, and the sunsets were absurd. This deep orange bleeding into purple, the heat shimmering off the water until the very last light that I had heard about Bluffton from a guy at the bait shop in town. The original town had been submerged in 1937 when the dam was built, forcing residents to relocate. In dry years, parts of the old town would reappear. Foundations, crumbled stone walls, fence posts sticking up out of the cracked lake bed. People said if you were lucky, you might even hear the church bell, though the bell itself had been underwater. For decades I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but curiosity got the better of me. On my 4th day, the temperature dropped slightly, only in the high 80s, and a breeze came in from the west. The lake was so low I could see the skeletal remains of old piers sticking out of the mud. It looked like the lake had been peeled back to expose something private, something that wasn't supposed to be seen. I parked near an old boat ramp and walked down toward the newly exposed shoreline. The air was heavy with the smell of wet silt, thick and earthy, and every step I took made this faint sucking sound as my shoes pulled free from the mud. I could hear water lapping softly against the exposed foundations, a faint slapping that felt almost too rhythmic, like someone drumming fingers on a tabletop. About 100 yards out, I came to what looked like a crumbling stone wall, maybe 2 feet high, a foundation. Beyond that, a few more, all in a rough grid pattern. It was eerie how much it resembled a town, even in its skeletal form. The wind shifted, and I swear I heard a metallic sound drifting over the water. Not loud, just a faint, high-pitched ring. At first I thought it was a buoy, but there were no buoys out there. It came again, a little longer this time. A bell. I froze, listening. My ears strained against the quiet. There it was again. 3 slow tolls. I turned to look back toward the ramp. There was no one else around. No fishermen, no boats, nothing. My phone said 5:42 p.m., the sun already dipping low, the sky bleeding into that strange early evening gold. I told myself it was probably an echo from somewhere farther down the shore, maybe a cattle gate in the wind, and I kept walking. The mud got thicker, clinging to my shoes like it didn't want to let me go. That smell, that swampy, rotting smell, got stronger. Then I saw it. The church, not intact, of course. Just the lower portion, the walls cracked and leaning, the windows nothing but jagged holes. The roof was gone. It was tilted slightly, like it had been trying to sink deeper into the earth, but had stopped halfway. Inside, water pooled in dark patches, reflecting the orange light. The bell tower was still standing, unbelievably, though, stripped of anything recognizable. No bell, just empty crossbeams where it should have been. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on something brittle. When I looked down, I saw they were snail shells, hundreds of them, all clustered together. The air was cooler inside, stiller. That's when I heard footsteps outside. Not the slow, dragging sound of someone walking in mud. These were light, deliberate, moving just beyond the doorway. I turned, expecting to see someone in a hat, maybe a local come to check on me. But there was nothing. Then the bell rang again. It was so loud now I felt it in my chest, vibrating in the air around me. But I could see that the bell was gone. Something moved across the far doorway. Just a shadow. No shape I could name. Just a shift in the dim light. Like something tall had passed between me and the sun. I told myself I'd had enough, turned, and stepped outside. The moment I did, the sound stopped. No bell, no footsteps, just the wind pushing against the brittle grass at the shoreline. The walk back to the ramp felt longer than before. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the foundations and walls just stood there in the fading light, patient and silent. When I reached my car, I noticed something strange. The mud on my shoes was gone. They were wet, yes, but perfectly clean, like I'd walked through fresh water instead of muck. That night, lying in bed, I could still hear the bell in my head. Not constantly, just every so often, maybe once an hour, always 3 slow tolls. I tried drowning it out with music, but it felt like the sound was coming from inside my skull. I left the next morning. I didn't even tell the rental owner why. I just dropped the keys in the lockbox and drove straight out of Llano County Point 2. Weeks later, out of curiosity, I looked up recent photos of the lake. The drought had ended early. A massive rainstorm had rolled through and the water level was back to normal. Bluffton was submerged again, but in one of the photos, taken from a drone, you could see the church under the water. The windows were black, the tower tilted, and through the murky green you could just make out a shape swinging inside the empty tower. It wasn't a bell. It looked like a person. It was late October of last year when I drove out to Sherwood, Texas. It was one of those stubbornly warm fall afternoons in West Texas, the kind where the air is dry enough to chap your lips, but still carries the faint smell of mesquite and dust. The sun was lowering behind a pale blue sky, casting long shadows across the flat, empty highway. I'd left San Angelo after lunch with no real purpose other than to kill some time before meeting a friend in Mertzon for dinner. Sherwood had been a name on a road sign I'd passed for years, and I'd heard there wasn't much left, just a few buildings and an old courthouse that the county abandoned decades ago. When I turned off the highway onto the narrow, cracked road that led into town, I expected maybe a handful of old houses. Instead, it felt like I'd stepped into a photograph from a century ago. The courthouse sat in the middle of what used to be a square, a pale limestone building with arched windows and a small, rusted cupola on top. The lawn around it was yellowed and dry, broken here and there by patches of stubborn green weeds. There were no cars, no people, just the occasional whisper of wind pushing dry leaves across the road. On the north side of the lawn, near the corner, was a large oak tree. Thick trunk, sprawling branches, and a few stubborn brown leaves still clinging despite the season. I remembered reading something years ago about Sherwood's history, a passing mention of a double hanging in the 1890s. The description said it happened under the lone oak beside the courthouse. Standing there in the fading light, I realized I was looking at that very tree. I parked on the curb and got out. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not just quiet, but a heavy, almost muffled stillness. Even in small towns, you expect to hear a dog bark or the hum of an air conditioner somewhere, but Sherwood had none of that. Just my footsteps crunching on the dry grass as I walked toward the tree. The bark was rough beneath my hand when I reached out to touch it. I wasn't thinking about the story, at least not seriously, until I felt a strange vibration under my palm. Not constant, but intermittent, almost like the faint pluck of a string. I pulled my hand back and told myself it was just my pulse echoing in my fingertips. But when I laid my hand against it again, I heard something. Faint, high up in the branches. It was a creaking noise, like an old wooden swing shifting in the wind. Only there was no wind. I stood there for a moment, head tilted, listening. The sound was irregular, 2 short creaks, then silence, then another long one that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I glanced up through the twisted branches, half expecting to see a rope still hanging there. There was nothing but sky. I told myself I was just letting the local legend get in my head. I stepped back and walked around the courthouse instead. The windows were clouded with dust, but I could see inside, rows of wooden benches, a judge's bench up front, and a scattering of papers on the floor. The place smelled faintly of old wood and dry rot. I just rounded the back of the building. when I caught movement near the tree out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, like someone stepping out from behind the trunk. I turned fast, but no one was there. I thought maybe it was a deer, but there was nowhere for anything that large to vanish without me seeing it. That was when I started to feel it. Not fear, exactly, but a creeping awareness that I wasn't alone. The longer I stood there, the more it pressed in, like the air itself had thickened. My ears felt strange, the way they do in a storm when the pressure drops. I told myself I'd just get a couple of photos and head back to the car. I snapped one of the tree, one of the courthouse, and one of the empty road leading out of town. When I lowered my phone, I froze. There was someone standing in the shadow under the oak that I couldn't see their face clearly. The sun was behind them, but I could make out the outline of a man in old-fashioned clothes. Long coat, wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't moving. I blinked and tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light and shadow, but then he stepped forward into the sunlight. That's when I realized something was wrong. His face wasn't shadowed anymore, but it still wasn't visible. It was indistinct, like my eyes refused to focus on it. I took a slow step backward, my throat dry, and the man tilted his head slightly, as though curious. "Can I help you?" My voice sounded too loud in the still air that he didn't answer. Just kept staring, or I assumed he was staring. Then, in one slow movement, he raised his arm and pointed up at the branches of the oak. I followed the gesture, and that's when I saw it. A rope. Not all of it, just a length of frayed hemp swaying gently in the still air, maybe 15 feet up. My chest tightened. I looked back down at the man, but the spot under the tree was empty. I didn't think. I just turned and walked quickly back to my car. The moment my hand touched the door handle, I heard it again, creaking. Louder this time, rhythmic. I forced myself to look over my shoulder, just for a second. There were 2 ropes now, swinging in perfect unison. The road out of Sherwood felt twice as long as when I came in. I didn't stop driving until I reached Mertsan. When I finally parked, outside the diner where I was meeting my friend, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, thinking it was a text, but the screen was lit with the camera app, still open from when I'd taken the pictures. Only there was a new photo I didn't remember taking. It was of the courthouse lawn, the oak tree, and 2 dark shapes hanging from the branches. Their faces were blurred. I never went back to Sherwood. But sometimes, when the night is quiet enough, I swear I can hear that creak again. Slow, patient, waiting. Once the county seat, now a ruin in the mesquite. A vigilante mob lynched a man here in 1911. They buried him outside consecrated ground. Hunters say they see a shadow pacing the dirt road, lantern in hand, searching for a town that no longer exists. It was late October of last year when I made the drive out to Stiles, Texas. The sun was low when I left Big Lake, burning an orange path across the highway. The air smelled like dust and mesquite, and there was no wind. Just that still, heavy quiet you sometimes get in West Texas before the weather changes. I had my camera gear in the passenger seat, along with a cooler and a half-empty thermos of coffee. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was chasing the light for a photo project about abandoned places. The road to Stiles isn't much. You pass cattle guards and wind-bent fence posts, then the asphalt narrows to cracked concrete before giving up altogether to gravel. Cell service drops to nothing somewhere around the first dry creek bed. The only thing out there are oil pump jacks bowing endlessly, their slow creaks carrying faintly on the air. When I saw the old stone courthouse from a distance, it felt like finding a tooth in the dirt, something human, but long dead. The place was smaller than I expected. Just the shell of the courthouse, a few rubble piles that might have been houses, and a short stretch of dirt that could have been the main street. Mesquite trees had grown up through everything. The courthouse had no roof, just jagged limestone walls and doorways that opened into nothing. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I parked and took my camera out, walking slow, listening to the gravel crunch under my boots. The air was dry, and every breath brought that faint mineral smell you get from sunbaked stone. I walked through what was left of the courthouse, framing shots of doorways and collapsed staircases. My shadow stretched long and thin on the ground. That's when I heard it. A single, sharp sound, like a boot heel on gravel. I froze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was heavy, deliberate. I called out, Just a simple hello? My voice sounded strange in the open air, too loud, bouncing off the stone. Nothing answered that I figured it was a hunter or maybe a ranch hand cutting through, so I went back to shooting. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time, maybe 20 feet away. Crunch. Stop. Crunch. Stop. The timing felt wrong, like whoever it was matching my movements but staying just out of sight. I turned toward the noise, squinting into the mesquite thickets, but saw nothing. The trees swayed slightly, though the air around me was still that I told myself I was being jumpy. I even laughed under my breath, but I cut my shooting short. As I headed back to my truck, I noticed something strange. There were no other tire tracks in the dirt but mine, yet I could see footprints crossing the road about 20 yards ahead. They were deep, like the ground had been wet when they were made, but the earth was bone dry. That I stepped closer, crouched down, and realized the prints weren't quite right. The heel was too narrow, the arch too long, and there was no tread, just smooth impressions, as if someone had been walking barefoot, but with impossibly hard soles. The edges were sharp, like they'd been made minutes ago. That I decided I'd had enough. I got in the truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. That's when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Just a flicker of movement at the far end of the dirt road. A dim, swinging light, like someone carrying a lantern. It was too far to make out detail, but it moved with an odd, steady rhythm, almost a sway. That I told myself it had to be another photographer, maybe a camper with an old-style light. But the thought didn't sit right. Nobody in their right mind camps in styles. I put the truck in gear and started down the road, glancing in the mirror now and then. The light stayed the same distance behind me no matter how fast I went, bobbing gently, never getting closer, never falling back. When I hit the paved highway, it was gone. Just night behind me. My hands were sweating on the wheel. I drove back to Big Lake without stopping. That night, I sat in the motel with my laptop, looking through the day's shots. The first few were fine. Sun on the stone, the courthouse, walls. Then, in the last frame I took, there was something I hadn't noticed before. In the far left corner of the photo, between two mesquite trees, was a shape. Human-sized. Dark. The shoulders sloped oddly, and the head seemed just a little too narrow. There was no face. That I shut the laptop and told myself I was imagining it. 2 days later, back home, I got a call from the motel in Big Lake. The desk clerk said I'd left something behind. When I asked what, he said, "A lantern." I don't own a lantern. That I hung up and never called back. It was late October when I first heard about Belle Plaine. I was driving through central Texas on my way from Abilene to San Angelo, taking back roads because I'd been avoiding the interstate ever since my old pickup started acting up. The weather was that perfect fall mix of warm sun and a crisp undercurrent, the kind that makes you think about open windows and black coffee. I'd left early in the morning, the sky a pale blue smeared with high clouds, the air smelling faintly of cedar and dust. That I stopped at a tiny gas station outside of Baird. The place had 2 pumps, a rattling ice machine, and a handwritten sign in the window advertising deer corn. The clerk was an older man with a deep sunburn and a sweat-stained cap. While he rang me up, I asked him if there was a quicker route to Highway 67 without having to loop all the way back to I-20. He hesitated like I'd just asked for something he'd rather not say, then told me I could take Farm Road 2228 south, cut through Belle Plaine, and pick up the highway from there. "You'll save maybe 15 minutes, he said, his eyes flicking briefly to the dusty road outside. "But there ain't much out there. Belle Plaine's been dead longer than you've been alive. You'll see the old college on your left." I'd never heard of Belle Plaine, but I've always had this bad habit of chasing the past. Forgotten towns, abandoned motels, peeling hand-painted signs. They make me feel like I'm trespassing on someone else's memories. So, I took his advice. Farm Road 2228 was nothing more than 2 cracked lanes through yellowed grass and mesquite scrub. The land stretched flat for miles, fences sagging under their own weight. After about 15 minutes, I saw it. The ruins of a 2-story brick building sitting behind a tangle of hackberry trees. The roof was mostly gone, windows bricked up or covered with rusted sheet metal. In faded lettering above the entrance, I could just make out Belle Plaine College, EST 1881. The air felt still there in a way it hadn't on the drive. Even the sound of my truck engine seemed muted. I pulled over, telling myself I'd Just take a quick look before getting back on the road. The main path to the building was choked with weeds, but there were faint tire tracks, as if someone had been there recently. The front doors were gone, leaving a gaping shadow. Inside, the smell hit me first, not just dust, but something old and closed off, like paper rotting in damp. Sunlight cut through gaps in the walls, catching on drifts of plaster. I walked through what must have once been a common room. Pieces of furniture lay collapsed against the walls. In the corner, surprisingly intact, was a wooden rocking chair. The seat sagged a little, but the curved runners looked sturdy. It faced a boarded window as if someone had left it there to watch the light change. I don't know why, but I found myself drawn to it. My grandmother had one almost exactly like it, and for a second I could hear the sound it made in her old farmhouse, that gentle creak that became part of the house's rhythm. I kept going. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned with every step. I peeked into rooms that had been stripped bare except for the occasional desk or rusted bed frame. The air up there felt heavier, and I noticed a strange, faint scraping sound. I told myself it was a loose shutter in the wind. When I came back down, I froze in the doorway of the common room. The rocking chair was moving. It wasn't much, just the faintest forward and back sway, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. I looked at the boarded windows. Not a single crack of air was coming through. My first thought was that I must have bumped it earlier without noticing, but I'd been nowhere near it. I stepped toward it slowly. The chair stopped before I got too close, the wood settling into silence like it had been caught in the act. My palms were damp now, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I decided I'd seen enough. I backed toward the entrance, glancing over my shoulder at the chair until I was outside in the brighter, warmer air. When I got back to the truck, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There were fresh footprints in the dust beside the passenger door. They were small, almost child-sized, but bare, no tread pattern, just the outline of toes and a heel. The closest house I'd passed was miles back. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe some kids from Baird came out here to mess around. Maybe they'd been hiding when I pulled up. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the road. Through the branches, I caught one last glimpse of the college. The rocking chair was visible through the front opening now, angled toward me instead of the boarded window. I told myself. It was my imagination, just a trick of the light and distance. But here's the part that I can't reason away. Last night, 3 days after my trip, I woke up around 2 a.m. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet where you hear your own breathing. Then came a sound from the living room, a slow, steady creak. Wood against wood, just like my grandmother's chair used to make. I live alone. I don't own a rocking chair, and when I went to look, there was nothing there, just the faint scent of dust and something old that didn't belong in my house. I haven't been able to sleep since. I was driving west on Route 66 through Deaf Smith County in late October, around 2 in the morning. I'd been hauling furniture from Oklahoma City to Albuquerque, trying to make it through without stopping for the night. The highway was almost empty, just a couple of distant sets of headlights that would pass me in the other direction every 20 minutes or so. The weather had been clear all day, but as I crossed the Texas-New Mexico line, the air felt heavier, like a storm was building somewhere out in the dark. My GPS had me cutting through old stretches of Route 66 for a while before rejoining the interstate. Out here, the road is cracked and faded, with weeds pushing through in places, and most of the old towns you pass are nothing more than collapsed signs and leaning telephone poles. I was making good time until I saw the first sign. For Glenrio. It wasn't much, just one of those green highway markers with white lettering, but it caught my eye because the name sounded vaguely familiar. I remembered my grandfather mentioning it once, talking about a pit stop he used to make when driving this same route back in the 70s. Said it used to be a halfway point between Amarillo and Tucumcari, a row of gas stations and diners where everyone stopped before the interstate cut through and killed the place. When I reached the outskirts, I slowed down. The road narrowed, and the shoulder crumbled into scrub brush. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the ground, and in that light, I could see the outline of old storefronts lining the road like rotting teeth. A single boarded-up gas station stood at the center, its sign hanging crooked, the paint almost completely gone. The air felt still in a way that was unnatural for open plains. No wind, no rustle of grass. I cracked the window and got nothing but the faint smell of dust as I passed the gas station. I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I glanced over and saw what I thought was a figure standing just outside the overhang. Tall, with dark hair, wearing something red that moved slightly like fabric caught in a breeze. I slowed down more, but when I turned my head fully, there was nothing there. Just the boards over the station windows and the empty lot. I told myself it was nothing. Long drives make you see things, especially at night. I picked up speed again, but I kept glancing at my mirrors. A few minutes later, the radio crackled with static. I thought I'd lost the station, but the sound wasn't like normal interference. It came in pulses, short bursts, almost like tapping. I turned the dial but couldn't find anything clear, so I shut it off. The silence after was thick, and I realized I could hear a faint hum, high-pitched, almost like an old fluorescent light, flickering somewhere behind me. That's when I noticed something strange in the rear view. The gas station lights were on, not bright, just a sickly yellow glow spilling out from under the overhang, like they were running off a failing generator. I hadn't seen any power lines intact for miles. For some reason, my stomach turned cold. I told myself to keep driving, but my speed dropped again. Part of me wanted to turn around and make sure I wasn't imagining it. That was when my headlights picked up a figure standing on the shoulder ahead. It was a woman. She was wearing a long red dress that looked dated, the kind of thing you'd see in a black and white photo from the 50s. Her hair was dark and hung in waves over her shoulders. She had her arm out, waving in a slow, deliberate motion, palm down, like she wanted me to pull over. My first thought was that she needed help. Maybe her car had broken down. I started to brake, but something about her posture froze me. She wasn't moving toward me, just standing there with her head slightly tilted. The dress swayed gently, even though the air was dead still. I stopped about 20 feet from her. She didn't come closer. I leaned out the window and called, "You okay?" My voice sounded too loud in the quiet. She didn't answer, but she stopped waving and just lowered her arm slowly. I could see her face now, pale and expressionless. Then, as I stared, she turned, smoothly, almost mechanically, and stepped backward off the shoulder. There was nothing behind her but open field. I sat there for a second, trying to decide what to do, then grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The ground crunched under my boots. My beam cut across the weeds and dirt, but there was no sign of her. I swept the light across the field, flat, empty, stretching toward the horizon. That was when I heard it again. The hum. Only now it was louder, layered with a faint clicking sound. I turned the flashlight toward the direction it was coming from, and for a split second, I saw something red moving far out in the field. It disappeared when the beam touched it. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I got back in the truck and locked the doors. I didn't look back until I was nearly to the interstate, but when I finally glanced in the mirror, I could see the glow of the gas station again. This time, the light flickered in a steady rhythm, like it was keeping time with the hum I still swore I could hear under the roar of the engine. I didn't stop until I reached Tucumcari, where I pulled into a 24-hour diner and ordered coffee, just to be around people. I told the waitress about seeing someone on the road, and she gave me this look like she'd heard it before. She asked if it was a woman in a red dress. When I nodded, she said quietly, "They say she's been there since '78, flagged down a trucker in the middle of the night, then vanished before he could get her in the cab. Folks claim she's looking for a ride west, but no one who stopped ever made it past Glen Rio." I wanted to ask more, but something about her tone stopped me. I drank my coffee in silence, trying not to notice the faint buzzing in the diner's lights, which, for a moment, seemed to flicker in perfect rhythm with the hum I'd left behind on Route 66. It was July 16th, 2022, the kind of Texas summer day where the heat feels heavy enough to bend your spine. I had been driving since early morning, making my way west from Fredericksburg toward a friend's ranch outside Junction. The road that cuts through Gillespie County is mostly two-lane blacktop, winding between low hills and live oak groves, and for long stretches you see no one but the occasional pickup kicking up dust from a side road. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, I saw the sign DOS 5 miles. The name hit me in a strange way. I'd read about it years ago in an old Texas almanac, something about a German settlement, a farming community that never quite made it into the modern era. I didn't remember much more than that, except for a vague story that somewhere out here, back in 1904, a whole family had been found dead in their cabin, frozen solid in the middle of summer. I'd filed it away as one of those weird rural legends, the kind you expect to hear in old-timers' stories. The road narrowed as I came into Doss. If you can call it a town, it's barely one, an old gas station that looked like it hadn't pumped fuel in decades, a post office no bigger than a shed, and a scatter of weathered houses set back behind overgrown yards. The air smelled like hot dust and dry cedar. I slowed to 25 and kept going, figuring I'd pass through in under a minute. That's when I noticed the turnoff. No sign, just a narrow dirt road disappearing between two large oak trees. The grass at the entrance was strangely pale, almost a bleached yellow-white, like it had been burned without actually burning. I can't explain why I stopped. Something about it drew my eye in the way certain places just do. I checked my phone, no bars, and looked at the dashboard clock. I was ahead of schedule. I eased the car down the road. It was rutted and uneven, the kind of track you'd expect to see leading to a deer lease or an abandoned pasture. The oaks closed in overhead, dimming the sunlight, and within a few hundred yards the air felt cooler. Not refreshingly cool, uncomfortably. So, like the sudden drop you feel when you walk into a damp basement. Up ahead, I saw it. A small log cabin sat in a clearing, its walls silvered and warped with age. The roof sagged slightly at the middle, and the windows were just dark gaps. There was no sign of recent activity, no tire tracks, no footprints, no fence. Just pale grass swaying gently around it, each blade the same unnatural washed-out color. As the road's entrance, I got out of the car, leaving the door open. The stillness was immediate and heavy. No cicadas, no birds, just my own breathing and the faint crunch of dry grass under my shoes. The air smelled faintly metallic, like the inside of an old coin jar, when I stepped onto the cabin's porch. The boards creaked, but held. The front door was ajar. I knocked out of habit, my knuckles echoing hollowly inside, then pushed it open. The interior was dim, lit only by the rectangle of sunlight spilling through the door. There was a table in the center of the room, its surface covered in a thick layer of gray dust. A wood-burning stove sat cold in the corner. Against one wall, a narrow bed frame still held a mattress, though the fabric had rotted away in spots. To expose the coiled springs, I told myself it was just an old abandoned homestead. But then I noticed the chairs. 3 of them, all drawn up to the table, each one pulled out at an identical angle. The table was set, forks, knives, plates, all coated in the same dust, as if someone had laid them out and never came back. Something about the arrangement felt wrong. Not just old, staged. I backed toward the door, intending to leave, when I heard it. The faintest creak of a floorboard from deeper in the cabin. I froze. My mind raced to explain it. A raccoon, maybe, or a gust of wind shifting the boards. But the air in the cabin was perfectly still. I stepped outside quickly, the coolness clinging to my skin in a way that made me shiver despite the triple-digit heat outside the clearing. As I reached my car, I glanced back. Through the gap in the doorway, I thought I saw a shape at the edge of the shadowed back room. Not moving, just there, like someone standing perfectly still. I didn't wait to see more. I got in, started the car, and turned it around on the narrow track. But when I reached the main road, I realized something unsettling. The drive back had felt longer. I checked the clock. It was nearly 5 p.m. somehow. Over an hour had passed. Back on the highway, I tried to shake it off. The mind plays tricks. I told myself, rural places have a way of feeling strange to outsiders. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror for one last look at the oaks marking the turnoff, there was nothing there. Just unbroken pasture land. The pale grass gone as if it had never existed. I didn't tell my friend about it when I reached Junction. I didn't want to sound crazy. But that night, lying awake in the guest room, I couldn't stop thinking about the shape in the cabin. The more I replayed it, the more certain I became that it had been facing me. 2 days later, I tried to drive back. I followed the highway exactly, watching for the faded gas station, the post office, the turnoff. I found the first 2 easily enough, but between them, there was nothing but a stretch of barbed wire fence and mesquite. No pale grass, no oaks, no road. That was last summer. I've since looked into the 1904 incident I half remembered. The family's name was Capel. According to old Gillespie County records, a neighbor found them all seated at their dinner table in July. Mother, father, 2 children, rigid and cold to the touch despite the sweltering heat. No signs of struggle, no spoiled food, no cause of death ever determined. The property, the record notes, was left to the earth, the grass upon it of unusual pallor. The more I read, the more it bothered me. The official records list the location as unmarked, east of Doss, but when I asked a local historian if she knew where it was, she paused for a long moment before saying, "You won't find it twice." Last week, I found something tucked under the driver's seat of my car while cleaning it. It was a fork, tarnished silver, its handle carved with an old German monogram I didn't recognize. The tines were still cold when I picked it up. I live 3 hours from Gillespie County. The air conditioner in my apartment has been broken for 2 days. The heat index outside is 104, yet when I hold that fork, my breath clouds in front of me. And at night, I swear I can hear the sound of a floorboard creaking, slowly, patiently, somewhere just past the edge of the dark. I drove into Thurber, Texas, a little after 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in late October. The weather had that strange in-between feel, still warm in the sun, but with a thin, almost metallic bite in the air whenever a cloud passed. The sky was the dull gray-blue you get before an early autumn cold front, the kind that rolls in with wind but no rain. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere off I-20 trying to find a backroad to Stephenville, and my phone had just enough signal to show me that Thurber was the only marked place for miles. The town was small, smaller than I expected. Just a scattering of brick buildings on either side of a wide, empty street. No gas stations, no grocery stores. The kind of place where even the stop signs looked like they hadn't been touched since the 1970s. I parked near what looked like an old mercantile store. The sign faded but still faintly legible. Thurber Company Store, AST 1888. The wooden doors were locked, but the glass was so dusty I couldn't see inside anyway. It was unnervingly quiet. No cars passed while I sat there. No dogs barking. No wind through the trees. Mostly because there weren't any trees, just tall, dry grass stretching to the edges of the brick structures. The only smell was this faint, acrid tang, like burnt wood soaked in oil. It reminded me of the smell you get from an old wood stove after a season of disuse, but sharper. That I wandered a little, taking pictures for no real reason. The buildings were all brick, different shades, but all clearly from the same kiln. The history signs scattered around explained that Thurber had once been a coal mining company town, later switching to brick manufacturing after the mines closed in the 1920s. The company left in the 30s. The people left not long after, but they'd kept some of the buildings as historical exhibits. I didn't see anyone working at them, though. When I reached the far end of the street, I found a small fenced-off lot with a low concrete foundation. A plaque read, "Entrance to shaft number 3, closed 1914 after fatal collapse." Someone had left flowers there, fresh, not plastic. White lilies. No, I was about to head back to my car when I heard it. A sound that didn't fit with the stillness, like something shifting underground. Not metal, not rock exactly. A low, hollow scrape, then a faint thump. I froze and listened, but it didn't repeat. I told myself it was just the settling of old debris in the mine shaft. Maybe an animal moving around down there. As I walked back down the main street, I noticed something strange about the windows. In the old buildings, the glass was rippled with age, but in one shop, I thought I saw movement inside. A shadow shifting, as though someone was walking slowly across the room. But the shop was clearly locked and dark. I was debating whether to try peering in when a voice startled me from behind. Not much to see here anymore. I turned and saw an older man standing about 10 feet away, wearing worn jeans, a faded red flannel, and a black ball cap with no logo. His face was lined, eyes pale blue and almost watery. He was smiling, but not in a friendly way. More like he was amused I was there at all. "I took a wrong turn," I said. "Thought I'd check it out. Most people just keep driving. Place looks dead, don't it?" "Yeah," I admitted. "You live here?" "Nearby," he said, glancing toward the hills to the south. "Don't see many strangers unless they're lost or curious." He said the last word with a strange pause, like it was a warning that he told me the town used to be bigger, busier. Said his granddad had worked the mines before the collapse shut them down. He used to say he'd hear things down there before the walls went. Black shapes moving where the light didn't reach. Said if you heard the scrape, you knew they were close. I thought he was telling me some local ghost story, so I smiled politely. Guess you've heard the scrape a time or two yourself then? The man didn't laugh. He just looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You don't want to be here after dark." Then he walked away down the street without another word. Something about the way he left unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I decided to head out, but when I got back to my car, my phone had no signal at all, not even a flicker. I tried the ignition. The engine cranked, sputtered, and died. I tried again. Nothing. It was then I noticed the smell had gotten stronger. That burnt, oily coal smell was sharp enough to make my eyes water. I got out and popped the hood, though I know next to nothing about fixing engines. The metal was warm, but not overheated. I shut it again and stood in the street, trying to decide if I should walk toward the highway or see if that old man had gone into one of the houses. The sound came again, louder this time. A deep, dragging scrape, like a heavy stone pulled across concrete, followed by a muffled, rhythmic thumping. It seemed to come from under my feet. The pavement felt faintly vibrating when I crouched and touched it. I told myself. There had to be an old ventilation tunnel or hollow under the street. That's when I noticed the windows again. Every single one of them. On both sides of the street. The windows that had been dusty and dark now had shapes behind them. Not people exactly, more like silhouettes. They were too still, too sharply outlined in the dimness. The hair on my neck rose as I realized they were all facing the street. Facing me. I backed toward my car, keeping my eyes on them. None of them moved, but I could swear the silhouettes in some windows were closer to the glass than before. The scrape came again, this time from multiple directions, like something shifting underground in several places at once. The smell was choking now. My eyes watered, and the back of my throat burned. I tried the car one more time, and this time it roared to life, so suddenly I almost screamed. I floored it, not caring if I wrecked the suspension on the uneven road. When I reached the highway, the smell faded as quickly as if someone had flipped a switch. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the empty street shrinking behind me. Empty, no figures in the windows, no sign of the old man. I didn't slow down until I was well past Gordon. My phone beeped as service returned, but when I checked, the photos I'd taken in Thurber, half of them wouldn't open. The thumbnails showed distorted, black shapes bleeding into the brick walls, but when I tapped them, the files were corrupted. That night, at home, I woke to the smell. Faint but there, like burnt coal, drifting through my bedroom. I live over 100 miles from Thurber. I was driving through West Texas last September, taking the long way from El Paso to Marfa. It was late afternoon, around 5:30, the heat still pressing down even though the sun was dropping. The air outside shimmered over the asphalt. The sky was cloudless, and the only real sound in my car was the hum of the tires against the road. I'd read about Shafter before, a near-ghost town, once a silver mining hub in the late 1800s. Population had never been big, even at its peak, and now there were fewer than 20 permanent residents. I'd planned on passing through without stopping, but when I saw the faded sign with flaking white paint, Shafter, I slowed down. The place felt like it was holding its breath. A few buildings still stood, sun-bleached wood storefronts, with missing boards, an old church leaning just slightly to one side, its steeple warped from years of dry heat. Dust devils whipped across the road ahead. Somewhere far off, I heard the faint buzz of a cicada, which struck me as odd, since I couldn't see a single tree. I pulled over near a crumbling adobe wall. The heat slapped me when I stepped out, the smell of dry earth mixing with something faintly metallic. The silence was heavy, only broken when the wind pushed grit against my jeans. A man in a wide-brimmed hat was sitting in the shade of a collapsed awning across the street. I thought maybe he was a local, so I waved and called out hello. His head turned slowly. Even from where I stood, I could see his eyes, pale, almost washed out, watching me without expression. "You're a little late for the tour," he said after a moment. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in a while. I told him I was just passing through, curious about the town's history. He nodded toward the hills to the north. "Mines are all closed now. Safer that way." Before I could ask more, he added, "Don't go walking north. Sun plays tricks on people. That's how they get lost." The way he said it made me feel like he wasn't talking about heat stroke. That I thanked him and got back into my car, planning to keep moving, but I caught something in my rearview mirror as I started to pull away. 3 figures, far out beyond the edge of the highway, walking together across the pale desert floor. They were too far to make out details, just silhouettes wavering in the heat haze. It struck me because there was nothing out there. No road, no shade, no reason to be walking that way. My first thought was maybe they were hikers or ranch hands, but the way they moved was strange. Their steps were slow and synchronized, like they were being pulled forward rather than choosing where to go. I pulled over again and got out my camera with the zoom lens. By the time I brought it to my eye, the shimmer made them blur and ripple. Then, nothing. The space where they'd been was empty. A truck rattled past me from the opposite direction. The driver, an older Hispanic man with a lined face, slowed down when he saw me standing by the road. He rolled down his window. "You saw them, didn't you?" I hesitated. 3 people. He nodded once. "Don't follow. Don't even think about it." Without another word, he drove off. I told myself it was just the heat, that maybe the figures had been a mirage. But that night in Marfa, I couldn't get them out of my head. Their movements had been too deliberate for heat distortion. I decided I'd go back the next morning. When I reached Shafter again, the air was cooler, the sky a pale gray from distant rain. The streets were empty. The man with the pale eyes wasn't at the awning anymore. I parked and walked toward the north edge of town where the desert opened wide. It felt different. The silence was sharper, like I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I spotted a faint trail leading out into the sand and gravel, and without really thinking about it, I started following it. The ground crunched under my boots, the wind tugging at my shirt. After maybe 10 minutes, I stopped. Ahead of me, just where the horizon began to bend from the Earth's curve, the 3 figures stood. They were facing away, the backs of their clothes stiff with dust, wide-brimmed hats tilted low. My heart was thudding harder now, but I took a step forward. They didn't move. Then, as if they'd heard me, their heads turned, not all the way, just enough that I could see part of their faces. Skin stretched tight over bone, lips pale and cracked. Their eyes, I don't know how to describe them except they looked wrong. Dull, like river stones. I stumbled back, but when I looked again they were gone. Just open desert. The wind picked up hard, stinging my eyes with grit. I turned to head back to my car, but the trail was gone. I mean completely gone. No footprints, no disturbed gravel. Just flat, untouched ground in every direction. For a moment, I was sure I was turned around, that I'd wandered in a circle. My throat was dry, my chest tight. I forced myself to pick a direction and walk fast. Eventually, the outline of the town came into view, and I practically jogged to my car. Before I left, I looked back once. The northern desert shimmered under the cloud light, and there they were again. 3 shapes, perfectly still, facing the town this time. I didn't wait to see if they'd move. I got in my car, turned the key, and drove until Shafter was a memory in my rear view. That was 11 months ago. Last week, driving near Presidio at sunset, I saw something in the heat haze beside the road. 3 figures, far out on the plain, walking toward the highway. I kept driving. I didn't look in the mirror, but I've started waking in the night, with the sound of gravel crunching outside my bedroom window. And last night, I could swear I heard 3 sets of footsteps. Flooded by the river and rebuilt on higher ground. The original site is nothing but foundations now. Campers say voices carry across the flat at night, soft, pleading, and cut off by the splash of water. It was late April, just after one of those early Texas storms that leave the air heavy and clean at the same time. I had been driving back from Amarillo, cutting through Donley County on the way to visit a friend in Childress. The sun was still high, the sky an almost artificial blue. Highway 287 was dry, but you could see where water had pooled in the ditches. Earlier that morning, I don't usually take side roads, but the map on my phone showed a little scenic detour that passed by something called Clarendon Old Town Site. I'd never heard of it. The description on a local history page said the original Clarendon had been built too close to the Salt Fork of the Red River, got wiped out in a flood in the 1890s, and was abandoned. They rebuilt it on higher ground, where the current town stands, but the original site was still out there, just empty foundations and weeds that I had time to kill, so I figured I'd check it out. The turnoff was a narrow farm-to-market road with no shoulder, bordered by barbed wire fences and open pasture. About 3 miles in, the fields dropped away and the land flattened into this strange, shallow basin. The grass was tall and yellowed, with clumps of wild sunflowers and mesquite. I could see the glint of water in the distance, but it wasn't a proper lake. More like the river had swollen out of its banks and then receded, leaving irregular pools behind that a battered historical marker stood by the road, leaning at a slight angle. The sign talked about the flood, how the townspeople moved, and how nothing remained except some stone foundations and cellar holes. No tourist parking, no trails, just a metal gate you could unlatch and step through if you wanted to. It was maybe 5:15 p.m. when I parked off the road and walked in. The air was still damp and smelled faintly metallic, like wet iron. Cicadas buzzed from the mesquite stands, and somewhere in the distance, a cow bellowed. The ground was uneven, soft in places. I found what looked like the footprint of an old building, just a rectangle of flat stones sunk into the dirt, half hidden under grass. Another side had a few weathered bricks scattered in a shallow depression. It was quiet except for the wind moving through the grass. Then, faintly, I thought I heard voices. It was so soft at first I couldn't tell if it was just the wind carrying from the highway. A murmur, low and steady, like someone speaking in another room with the door closed. I turned toward the sound, trying to pin down a direction. It seemed to come from near one of the shallow pools left by the floodwater. I walked that way slowly, feeling a little ridiculous for expecting to find anyone out here. As I got closer, the murmuring grew clearer, but not clear enough to make out words. It was higher pitched than I expected, more like a woman's voice. Then I caught something strange in the rhythm of it. Not conversation, more like pleading. "Hey," I called out, instantly feeling like an idiot. "Hello." The sound stopped. The wind seemed to hold still too. Then there was a single splash, like something heavy dropping into water. I scanned the pool. It was maybe 20 feet across, brown and still, with a rim of cracked mud. No ripples, no sign of movement. I stood there for another minute, listening, but heard nothing else. Figuring it was probably just some bird or animal, I headed back toward the gate. I'd almost reached the road when I heard it again. Louder this time, from farther off to my right. The same pleading tone, a little desperate now. It sent a quick chill up my neck because it sounded exactly the same as before, like a recording being played again. I told myself it was just an echo, or maybe some trick of the land carrying sound weirdly, and I left. That night, I stayed at my friend's place in Childress. Over dinner, I mentioned stopping by the old site. He froze for a second, then said, "You didn't stay after dark, did you?" I laughed. "No." "What?" He leaned in a little. "Couple years ago, some folks from Amarillo camped out there. Said they heard voices all night. Around 3 in the morning, they all woke up at once, swore they heard someone calling for help out on the flats. When they went to check, they saw wet footprints coming up from the water toward their tents. But there wasn't anybody there. I wanted to call. It's just a story, but I didn't mention what I'd heard earlier. The next day, I was heading back the same way and slowed as I passed the turnoff. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe curiosity, maybe just wanting to prove to myself that nothing weird had happened, but I pulled over again. It was earlier this time, about 3 in the afternoon. The place looked the same, still, and quiet. No voices, no splashes. But when I walked out to the same pool, I noticed something new. Along the cracked mud at the edge, leading away from the water, were several sets of footprints. Bare, narrow. The toes pointed toward the foundations. They didn't look fresh exactly, but they also weren't weathered enough to be from the 1890s. The weirdest part was the spacing. The prints were close together, like whoever left them had been shuffling, or maybe too tired to lift their feet properly. I followed them for about 30 yards until they faded into the grass. There was no other sign of anyone having been there. When I reached my car again, I heard something faint under the wind. A woman's voice, pleading, just like before. Only this time, I could make out a few words. "Help me. It's dark." The sound cut off with another splash. I got in my car and left fast. I haven't gone back. But every time I think about it, I remember one thing I didn't notice until later. The footprints I saw, every single one was pointed toward the gate, toward the road. but they ended before reaching it, like whoever left them just never made it out. It was the second week of October 2018 when I first drove through Wheaton, barely there, in the north end of Stevens County, Georgia. I remember the weather because it had that crisp, early autumn bite where the air is thin enough to make sound carry farther than it should. The sky was cloudless, the sun already sinking, throwing long shadows across the two-lane highway. The road signs were faded, pocked with rust, and the only thing that told me I'd actually entered a town was a warped green marker that read Wheaton, POP. With no number after it, I'd taken a wrong turn heading back from a weekend. In the mountains, my phone had no signal, GPS frozen on a blue dot that wouldn't budge. The map showed only a couple of gray lines for roads, all with unfamiliar names. Wheaton wasn't even on it. The town, if you can call it that, consisted of a low brick building with a hand-painted sign reading Post Office in peeling white letters, and a boarded-up wooden structure with a slanted tin roof. The boards were nailed unevenly over what I guessed had been a front door. It looked more like an abandoned church than anything else that I pulled over near the post office, figuring I might at least find someone who could point me back toward the main highway. The post office door was locked, the inside dark. A faded USPS hours sign was taped to the glass, but the last posted date was 2014. That's when I saw an older man sitting on a milk crate in the shade of the boarded building. He wore a sun-bleached baseball cap and was whittling a piece of wood with a folding knife. His shirt had a dark ring of sweat around the collar, and he looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You're not from here," he said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "No," I said. "Just got turned around. I was hoping to get directions." He studied me for a moment, then pointed his knife toward a narrow road running between two fields. "Follow that west for about 5 miles. You'll hit the main. Don't go past. Dark." Something in his tone made me pause. "Is there a reason?" He looked down at the piece of wood he was carving, his knife making small, deliberate strokes. "This place holds on to the wrong kind of things," he said quietly. "Best not to linger." I thanked him, but as I turned to leave, my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the boarded-up building. What was this place? His knife froze mid-stroke. "School," he said. "Long gone now. Don't go near it." The way he said it, short, clipped, made my skin prickle. I got back in my car, but instead of heading west, I drove slowly past the building. Through gaps in the boards, I could see part of the interior. Warped floorboards, desks with their legs rusted through, and something I thought was a blackboard leaning crooked against the wall. The ground around it was wild with weeds, tall enough to brush against my side mirror. About 30 yards behind it, a sagging chain-link fence surrounded a patch of nothing. The grass was short there, like it had been cleared recently. No gravestones, no buildings, just bare ground and a few scattered stones that I should have left then. But I didn't. The sun dipped low as I parked on the roadside. The silence was the kind that feels heavy, like the air itself is pressing against your ears. I stepped through the weeds toward the fence. The metal was warm under my palm, the kind of heat that comes from holding the day's sun long after the light has faded. Something flickered at the corner of my vision. I turned and saw a faint glow through the cracks in the school's boards. Not bright, just the weak, steady flicker of a lantern. I told myself it was just sunlight catching on glass inside. But the sun was almost gone. There was no way. The air changed then. Not colder, just sharper, like the smell of rain before a storm. Only there wasn't a cloud in sight. My chest tightened with the sudden awareness that I was completely alone. No other houses or cars in sight. That I heard it then. Faint, rhythmic tapping from inside the school. Tap, tap, pause. Tap.it was enough to break through my bravado. I backed toward my car without turning my back on the building. The boards were just dark shapes now, the glow inside brighter against the deepening dusk. As I opened my car door, a woman's voice called out from inside the school. "Clear, close, wait." I froze, my hand still on the door handle. The voice came again, softer. "Don't leave me here." It wasn't panicked or pleading, just flat, like someone stating a fact that I couldn't see anyone through the boards, but the light inside shifted, like the lantern had been lifted from the desk. My legs felt weak. I got in the car, started it, and pulled away fast, watching in the rear view as the glow stayed in place. shrinking until it was just another point of light swallowed by the dark. That I drove west until my phone signal came back, then stopped at a gas station to collect myself. The cashier, a woman in her 60s, asked where I'd been driving from. When I mentioned Whedon, she stopped scanning my drink. "That place burned down years ago," she said. "What did?" I asked. "The school. Lightning hit it. Last teacher. They had vanished the night before. Folks say her lantern was still burning on the desk when the fire started. Thing is, nobody ever found a lantern in the rubble." I didn't tell her what I'd seen, that I took the long way home after that, avoiding the county altogether. But a few nights ago, I woke up in my apartment to that same faint tapping. Tap, tap, pause, tap, and somewhere outside my window, in the reflection of the glass, a dim, flickering light. It was the first week of October, 2021. The air had that dry, brittle quality that Texas gets before a cold front moves in, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue. I was driving back from San Antonio toward Cuero after visiting my cousin. I had a few hours of daylight left, but the sun was already starting to slip toward the horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the highway. I wasn't in a hurry, so when I saw the faded green sign for Concrete Cemetery, 2 miles, I decided to take the turn. Concrete is one of those Texas towns you won't find unless you're looking for it, and even then, you might think you've taken a wrong turn. The place hasn't been a real town in over a century. The railroads bypassed it, and the people followed the tracks out. Now there's nothing but a handful of rusted fences, collapsing barns, and the cemetery. I'd heard of it before. Someone in Cuero told me it was one of the oldest burial grounds in DeWitt County, older than the Civil War. He also said, in that half-joking way locals have, that you shouldn't be there at dusk unless you wanted to bring something home. The road to the cemetery was gravel, narrow, and lined with gnarled mesquite trees. The grass on either side was tall and brown, whispering against my truck as I eased through. Every so often, a grasshopper would bounce off the hood or windshield. The cemetery gates were nothing special, just 2 rusted metal posts with a chain across them and a small gap to walk through. The sign above the posts was warped with age, the word concrete barely visible under layers of flaking white paint that I parked off to the side, leaving the truck half on the grass. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. Even the cicadas were quiet. The smell hit me first, a mix of dry earth, dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust. I stepped inside. The headstones were scattered in no particular order, some leaning, some broken, a few sunk almost completely into the ground. The oldest markers were simple limestone slabs with barely legible carvings. I ran my fingers over one and felt the grooves of a name I couldn't quite read. Sarah L. 1851 to 1862. 10 years old. I looked up and saw that the newer graves, from the 1940s and 50s, were further back, almost as if the cemetery had grown in reverse. About 20 minutes in, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned, expecting to see another visitor, maybe someone from town. But there was nothing, just my truck and the empty road stretching between the mesquite trees that I brushed it off. Sound travels strangely in wide open spaces. A little later, as I walked toward a fenced family plot in the far corner, I noticed something odd. The sun was low enough now that the shadows were long and clear. Mine stretched ahead of me, pointing toward the graves. But there was another shadow beside mine. It was faint, like the outline of a person standing just over my shoulder. My first thought was that it was from one of the taller headstones catching the light at the right angle. I turned around, scanning for anything that could cast it, but there was only open space behind me. When I faced forward again, the extra shadow was gone. The air felt heavier after that, like the temperature had dropped a couple of degrees. I decided to head back to the truck before the sun dipped below the trees. As I passed the older graves again, I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Someone, or something, ducking behind one of the monuments. "Hello." My voice sounded small against the stillness. No answer. I walked faster. My boots scuffed against the dirt, echoing louder than they should have. Another crunch came from behind me, in perfect sync with my steps, but just slightly delayed, like a half-beat echo. I stopped. The sound stopped. That was when I heard the breathing. It was faint, coming from maybe 10 feet behind me. Slow and steady, but not mine. I didn't want to turn around. My hands were clammy, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my neck. Finally, I forced myself to glance over my shoulder. Nothing, just rows of headstones and the dying light. I broke into a jog. When I reached the gates, the chain was swinging, though I hadn't touched it going in. I stepped through, and for a moment, I could have sworn there was a figure standing among the stones. Tall, thin, perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. The drive back toward Cuero felt longer than it should have. The sky was a deep orange now, and the shadows from the mesquite trees cut across the road like bars. In the rearview mirror, I kept thinking I saw a movement in the bed of my truck, a shift of dark against darker, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that slow, steady breathing. 2 days later, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. It was late afternoon, and I was in my driveway, loading some tools into the truck. The sun was at my back, casting my shadow long across the gravel. And there, beside mine, was another shadow. It wasn't touching me, but it was closer than it had been at the cemetery, and it was facing the wrong way. I was in Indianola, Texas, in late November of 2022, staying for a week at my uncle's bay house. It wasn't a vacation exactly. I'd just gone through a messy breakup in Austin, and he offered the place as a quiet escape. Indianola is barely a town anymore, just a scattering of houses, bait shops, and RVs along Matagorda Bay. When I arrived, the weather was gray and cool, low clouds hanging over the water like a ceiling you could almost reach up and touch. The air smelled of salt, fish, and something faintly metallic. My uncle's place sat maybe 30 yards from the shoreline, a squat one-story with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch. The first night was uneventful. I ate takeout shrimp from a styrofoam container, listened to the wind thud against the siding, and fell asleep early. The second night, I noticed something strange while walking along the pier just before dark. The water looked darker than it should have been, not just from the cloud cover, but almost black, as if it had depth beyond the bay's usual murky green. A shrimp trawler moved across the horizon, but its wake seemed to vanish within a few feet, swallowed instead of spreading. I told myself it was just the lighting and headed back. On the third day, I woke to the sound of voices. At first, I thought it was the TV in the living room, but the tone was wrong, muffled, like someone speaking through thick glass. I pulled on a hoodie and stepped outside. The voices stopped. The only sound was the steady lap of the tide. Across the water, the pier posts were slick and dark, and I noticed that the tide line was higher than the day before. That afternoon, I drove into Port Lavaca for groceries. The cashier, a woman in her 60s with weathered skin, noticed my Indianola address on the receipt and said, "You watch that water out there." Her tone wasn't playful. I laughed awkwardly and asked what she meant. She just shook her head and muttered, "It comes up faster than you think." That night, I woke again to the sound of voices, but this time there was something else, a deep, rhythmic thud, like something knocking against the pier supports. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The tide had risen again, almost, touching the bottom of the dock stairs. The beam of my light swept across the water, catching movement. Not fish, not debris, but something pale, maybe 5 or 6 feet down, swaying gently. I told myself it was just sea grass catching the light. Still, I went back inside and locked the door. By day 5, I'd stopped sleeping well. The air had turned heavier, and every night the tide crept a little closer. The locals I saw at the bait shop avoided eye contact when I mentioned it. That evening, as I sat on the porch, I noticed faint lights in the water. They weren't reflections from boats or the shore. These glowed from below, a dull yellow, bobbing slowly as if suspended. They would appear for a moment, drift, then vanish. I watched for nearly an hour before a wind came up, and they disappeared entirely. The 6th night was the worst. I'd been half dozing on the couch when the knocking started again, harder this time. Something heavy hit the dock. Then again, I forced myself to check, pulling the sliding door open just a crack. The wind had died completely. The bay was flat, but the water was higher than I'd ever seen it, lapping at the base of the porch steps. Floating in the shallows was a wooden door, old and water-swollen, its paint peeling in long curls. It rocked gently with the swell. My breath caught when I saw a hand. pale, limp, slip up from beneath it, fingers curling over the edge like someone steadying themselves. The door rolled slightly, and the hand vanished beneath with a slow, deliberate pull. I slammed the door shut and backed away. My phone had no service. I paced the living room for what felt like hours, jumping at every creak. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke just before dawn to silence. When I stepped outside, the water had receded back to its normal level. The door was gone. I left later that morning, not even bothering to clean up. As I drove past the bait shop, the same older woman from before was standing out front, smoking. She raised her hand in a slow wave, but didn't smile. A week after I got back to Austin, my uncle called. He asked if I'd gone into the attic while I was there. I told him no. Why? He said the pull-down ladder was hanging open when he arrived, and the attic floor was wet, as if something had been sitting up there dripping all night. He said it smelled like the bay. I live in San Antonio, and for most of my life, I thought ghost towns were the kind of thing you only saw in movies. My uncle proved me wrong in the summer of 2019. He's one of those men who loves forgotten places, the kind of person who stops to read every historical marker on a back road. One humid August afternoon, he called me and said, "Got something to show you. Ever heard of Helena, down in Karnes County?" I hadn't. We left around 2 in the afternoon. The sky was pale, blue with a few thick clouds bunching together near the horizon. It was one of those Texas days where the heat is like a heavy blanket, and the air smells faintly of sun-baked asphalt. The drive south took us off the interstate and onto narrow farm-to-market roads, past hayfields and rusting cattle gates. After about an hour and a half, we rolled into a place that didn't look like a town at all, more like the scattered bones of one. Helena had maybe 3 or 4 standing buildings, all weathered to a gray-brown color, their windows dusty and dark. A faded wooden sign read Helena, established 1852. There was no gas station, no grocery store, not even a stoplight. Just stillness. The kind of stillness where you realize you haven't seen another car in 10 minutes. That we parked in front of what looked like an old courthouse or maybe a church. The front steps sagged, and the doors were chained shut. My uncle pointed at a nearby marker and told me the story. Back in 1876, a stranger had gotten into trouble with the locals. They accused him of some theft, or maybe he just didn't belong there. A mob dragged him behind a horse through the dirt streets until he died. His widow, the story goes, stood over his body and cursed the town, promising it would dry up and rot. Not long after, the railroad bypassed Helena, and businesses died. People say the wind there sounds like screaming. I laughed when my uncle said it. It felt like one of those tourist attraction myths, the kind people make up to add color to a place that has nothing else left. That we walked around, peering into empty windows. The air was thick and heavy, but I noticed that when the breeze came through, it carried an odd tone. Not quite a whistle, not quite a moan, but not just wind either. My uncle glanced up when he heard it too, but didn't say anything. The strangest thing was the smell. The whole place reeked faintly of something metallic, like old pennies, mixed with the dusty, sunburned scent of dry wood. Every once in a while it seemed sharper, like when you step into a hardware store's plumbing aisle. That we made our way down what used to be Main Street. I saw a long, low building with half the roof missing. Painted letters, barely legible, read, "Mercantile." Inside, the sunlight slanted through holes in the roof, illuminating shelves with glass jars still on them. Some were filled with cloudy liquid. I told my uncle I didn't like the idea of opening them. He smirked, but didn't touch them either. As we came back outside, I noticed a man standing at the far end of the street. Tall, lean, dressed in a black long-sleeved shirt and a wide-brimmed hat, his face shadowed. I figured he was another history buff, but the second I glanced at my uncle to point him out and then looked back, he was gone. Not walking away. Gone. Weirded out, I told my uncle, but he just shrugged and said, "Probably lives nearby." Still, I didn't see a single vehicle, driveway, or mailbox anywhere. That we stopped at the old cemetery. Most of the graves were from the 1800s, their stones chipped and tilted, names erased by time. One was newer, from the 1960s, but the stone was cracked right down the middle. While my uncle wandered off to read inscriptions, I crouched to look at a marker so worn you could only make out the year, 1876. That was the year of the killing. I was brushing dirt from the stone when I heard it. A short, sharp gasp behind me, like someone had just realized I was there. I spun around, heart hammering, but the space between the graves was empty. The sunlight hadn't changed, but the air suddenly felt cold enough that goosebumps prickled my arms. By the time we got back to the truck, the shadows were long. My uncle said we'd take the back road home. As we pulled away, I looked out my window one last time. Up near the courthouse steps, a figure was standing again. Same black shirt, same hat, head tilted toward us. This time I didn't tell my uncle. The road out of Helena is nothing but straight dirt for miles, lined with mesquite and scrub. As we drove, the sound of the wind through the truck's open windows grew oddly loud. It wasn't whistling anymore. It had taken on a higher pitch, like the wailing of someone far away. My uncle reached to crank the window up, but the noise didn't stop. In fact, I realized it wasn't outside at all. It was coming from somewhere inside the truck, maybe from the back seat. That I turned around quickly, but nothing was there. Just our bags and the cooler. Still, the wailing kept up, low and mournful. My uncle's hands tightened on the wheel. Without looking at me, he said, "Don't answer it." His voice was flat, almost strained, like he'd been waiting for this to happen. I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, I caught movement in the side mirror. Someone was walking along the shoulder of the dirt road, keeping pace with us. The hat, the black shirt. No dust kicked up by their steps. No change in distance no matter how fast we went. The sound grew sharper, almost like words now, but not in any language I knew. The figure in the mirror seemed to be leaning forward slightly, as if speaking into the wind. We didn't stop until we reached the highway. The noise faded, but neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. When my uncle dropped me off, I asked him, "Have you heard it before?" He just looked at me, then at the empty road behind my apartment, and drove away without answering. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear it faintly through the half-open window, a dry, rushing sound that wasn't quite wind, carrying a note of something human, stretched thin with distance, calling for someone who should never answer. I was driving through Hardeman County, Texas, last November, taking the back roads between Quanah and Chillicothe. I had just finished visiting a friend in Amarillo and decided to make the trip slower and quieter, avoiding the main highways. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon when I saw the Medicine Mounds for the first time. Four low, rounded hills rising out of the flat land, like something deliberately placed there, too symmetrical to be natural. The weather was dry and clear. That kind of deep autumn sky where the blue feels endless. A cold wind carried the smell of mesquite and dust through my cracked window. I had read about Medicine Mound once, years ago. The Comanche considered it sacred ground, a place where the spirit world was closer. The old schoolhouse that served the community there burned down in 1942. I remembered that part clearly, because the article mentioned witnesses swearing they saw people dancing in the flames, but no bodies were ever found in the debris. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled off FM 1167 onto a narrow gravel road that headed toward the base of the hills. The road ran straight, bordered on both sides by knee-high dry grass and rusted barbed wire. About a mile in, I saw the skeletal remains of the schoolhouse. Just a rectangle of crumbling brick walls and a chimney still standing, stubbornly upright. The sun was low enough to throw long shadows that made the place feel colder than it probably was. I parked and got out. The wind whistled softly through the empty window frames. The inside was littered with broken glass and charred wood that had never been cleared away. The air smelled faintly of smoke, which made no sense after 80 years. I thought it might just be the scent of burnt timber that had somehow lingered. I started taking photos with my phone. In the distance, the mounds rose up, their slopes covered in scrub and twisted cedar. The light was shifting, that strange moment between afternoon and dusk where everything looks a little washed out. I heard a sound, not loud, just a faint rhythmic tapping, like knuckles drumming on wood. I froze and listened. The wind died for a moment, and the tapping stopped. When I walked toward the far corner of the building, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A shape ducked behind the wall, too tall and narrow to be a coyote or deer. I called out, "Hello? Someone out here." My voice carried in the open air, but there was no answer. I told myself it was probably another traveler, maybe a local teenager cutting through the place that I made my way around. I noticed something odd. The ground by the back wall was freshly disturbed, a strip of soil darker than the surrounding. Dry earth, as if it had been dug and filled again. There were boot prints leading away from it, not modern hiking boots, but smooth-soled, almost old-fashioned, like the kind you see in antique stores. That I decided I'd seen enough and started back toward my car. That's when I realized the wind had completely stopped. The air felt heavy, the way it does before a storm, but the sky was still perfectly clear. I could hear my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. And then I heard another set of footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, matching my pace. At first, then stopping when I stopped. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. The open stretch behind me was empty all the way to the schoolhouse. By the time I reached my car, the sun had slipped behind the mounds, and everything had a blue-gray tint. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, telling myself it was nothing. As I started the engine, I saw a movement in my rearview mirror. Someone was standing in the shadow of the schoolhouse, facing my car, that I could make out the outline of a long coat or robe moving in the breeze that I couldn't feel anymore. The figure didn't move toward me. It just stood there, and I couldn't see its face. I blinked, and for a second, it looked like there were more faint shapes gathering near the base of the chimney, as if they'd stepped forward out of the walls themselves. That I didn't wait to find out. I drove back to the highway without looking in the mirror again, but when I passed the mounds, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The tallest one, the one closest to the old school, had a faint reddish glow at its crest. It wasn't bright, more like the light of embers, and it pulsed slowly, as if something inside was breathing. I kept driving until I reached the next town, but the smell of smoke followed me all the way there, seeping into my clothes and hair. That night in my motel, I went through the photos I had taken. Most of them looked normal, but in the very last one, taken just before I turned to leave, I caught something I swear I hadn't seen at the time. Behind the broken wall, partially obscured, was a tall, thin figure leaning forward. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its hand, long, narrow fingers, was pressed flat against the brick as if it were listening. The metadata says that photo was taken at 4:52 p.m., but I know I didn't leave until after the sun had gone down. I don't remember losing that much time. And sometimes, when I'm in a quiet place, I think I can still hear that faint tapping, like knuckles on wood, somewhere just behind me. I had driven down to High Island on the evening of March 14th, 2023. It was one of those Gulf Coast days where the air feels like it's holding its breath, warm, but not quite oppressive, with a salt tang carried inland by a slow-moving breeze. I was there for bird photography. The rookery in the Boy Scout Woods Sanctuary draws in flocks of roseate spoonbills this time of year, and I'd been meaning to get some shots for my portfolio. I booked a cheap Airbnb on the edge of town, just a modest, single-story house that smelled faintly of cedar and lemon cleaner, owned by a retired couple who were off visiting family in Houston. High Island is tiny. A couple of gas stations, a cafe that closes by 7, and roads that go from asphalt to crushed shell without warning. To the south, marshland stretches toward the Gulf, flat and endless, punctuated only by the occasional water tower. The sky that evening was streaked with strips of orange and bruised purple. A light fog hung low over the marsh, giving everything a kind of soft-edged stillness. After dropping off my gear and grabbing a fried shrimp basket from the cafe, I drove down to a gravel turnout where the marsh met a narrow canal. There wasn't much wind, just the occasional ripple across the water's surface. That's when I first heard it. So faint I almost thought it was coming from my own head. A piano.it was playing a waltz, the notes delicate and spaced out, like the player wasn't in any hurry. It carried on the damp air, threading through the marsh grass. I stood there for a while, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from farther out in the wetlands, where there were no houses, no businesses, just water, reeds, and mud. I told myself it was probably a trick of sound. The town is old, and maybe there was a church or community center with a piano, and the acoustics just carried strangely in the fog. Still, there was something off about it. It was too steady. When I got back to the Airbnb, I mentioned it in a text to my sister. She just sent back a laughing emoji and said maybe I was hearing ghosts. I rolled my eyes and turned in early. The next morning, I was up before sunrise, eager to catch the spoonbills in good light. The air was cooler, and the marsh was busy with birdsong. I spent hours moving quietly along the boardwalks, snapping photos. But I kept catching myself glancing out toward the more remote stretches of reeds. In the daylight, it was just open marsh, nothing strange about it, but I found myself looking for, I don't know, a building, a boat, something that could have explained what I heard. There was nothing. That evening, after dinner, I decided to drive out again to the same turnout. The light was fading, and a thin mist curled up from the water. I killed the engine and stood by the canal. At first, there was only the sound of frogs and insects. Then, almost as if it had been waiting for the sun to dip, I heard the piano again. The melody was the same as before. Not exactly cheerful, but not sorrowful either. Something in between, like a dance for people who didn't realize the party had ended. I felt my chest tighten. The sound was closer this time, and I could make out a faint rhythmic tapping, like someone's foot marking the beat on a wooden floor. That I followed the sound down a narrow trail that ran along the canal, keeping my flashlight off so I could better judge the direction. The reeds got taller until they brushed my shoulders. The air grew cooler, heavy with the smell of brackish water and decaying vegetation. Then I realized something unsettling. The frogs had gone silent. The only sound was the piano. That I must have walked half a mile before I saw it. A faint glow ahead, diffused through the mist. Not electric light, but warmer, flickering, like candlelight. My rational brain told me it had to be someone camping. Yet the water here was ankle deep, and the reeds swayed in slow motion around me, as if reluctant to part. The music grew, louder until I could almost picture the keys moving under invisible hands. I stopped when I reached the edge of a wider pool. In the middle of it, barely visible through the fog, was a structure, not much more than the suggestion of a roofline and warped wooden beams, half sunken into the black water. The glow came from inside, spilling out in thin bands between broken slats. The piano was coming from there, clear and bright. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe an old hunting lodge? A floating dock? But the way it sat there, tilted and waterlogged, it felt older. The hair on my arms stood up. I suddenly became aware of how far I'd wandered from the road. The fog was thickening fast, curling around my legs, hiding the reeds in gauzy layers. I took a step back. The water made no splash, no ripple. That's when the music stopped. The IT didn't fade out. It just ceased, mid-note. The silence was total. My breathing was suddenly too loud, ragged. Then, from the direction of the building, came a slow, deliberate sound. The creak of a floorboard under weight. I turned and started back along the path, walking as fast as I dared without breaking into a run. I kept telling myself not to panic, to watch my footing. But after only a few minutes, I realized something that chilled me deeper than the fog. The creaking sound was following me. That I broke into a run, the reeds slashing at my arms. The path seemed longer than before, and the mist was swallowing my flashlight beam. My heart was hammering so hard it drowned out everything else, until I thought I heard, faint, behind me, the first hesitant notes of the waltz again. When I burst back onto the gravel turnout, my truck was sitting exactly where I left it, the metal cold with condensation. I drove back to the Airbnb without looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't go back to the marsh the next day. I packed my gear and left before dawn, ignoring the way the fog hung low over the fields, the way the air seemed to hold its breath again. That I still don't know what I saw or heard. I've looked up the history of High Island since. The marsh south of town used to be the shoreline before the 1900 hurricane obliterated the port village there. There were hotels, boarding houses, saloons. Most of it washed away, but some locals say that on still nights, you can hear music drifting over the water. They say it comes from a drowned saloon, still playing for guests who never left. That I've been trying to convince myself it was just sound carrying strangely through the marsh. But sometimes, late at night, I'll think about that moment when the music stopped, and I'll wonder if it was because whoever was playing realized I was there. On Thursday, May 20th, 2021, at 4:42 p.m., I pulled off Highway 90 just east of Alpine and turned south toward Terlingua. The car's outside temp readout said 94 degrees. The sun was a hard white coin above the windshield visor, and the sky was So clean it felt scraped. No clouds, just contrails thinning and a long pale horizon that made distance look dishonest. Wind from the southeast at maybe 10 miles an hour rolled dust across the Tulane. The air smelled like hot creosote and the faint, dry sweetness of mesquite. My phone had one bar, and the map told me the last leg would take me down through Study Butte and into Terlingua proper. I cracked the window and got the dry heat in my face and the taste of sand on my teeth and felt the relief, the peculiar relief that comes with driving toward nowhere in particular. I told myself it was a vacation. That's what I told my sister. When she called that morning, demanding proof, I remembered how to relax. I had 3 days before I had to be back in San Antonio to swallow fluorescent lights and email threads. I'd picked Terlingua because it had dead things and living things in a ratio I felt I could manage, because I liked old bones of buildings and sunburned history, because the borderland, when you're alone with it, has a way of feeling honest. I had read enough to be respectful, not so much I could kill the part of me that wants to be surprised. At T517, just north of Study Butte, the light turned a deeper gold. The Mercury mine tailings were pale scars in the hills and the Chizos Mountains. To the east looked like a sleeping spine. I pulled into a gravel turnout and cut the engine. The silence wasn't silence exactly. It was layered. There was a high, almost musical whine that came and went like someone rubbing the rim of a glass, and below that the faint, steady hum of air conditioning units on distant trailers, and below that something like breath from the land itself. You forget how loud your life is until you stand somewhere like that, where sound has no walls to bounce off. A pickup slowed, and the driver, a woman wearing a baseball cap with a big bend patch, leaned out and asked if I needed help. I lifted my hands. No, just stretching. She said, "It gets dark fast out here. Your headlights good?" And I nodded. She looked at my plates, looked at me the way locals look at people who look like they're about to do something thin-skulled. And then she told me where to get the best tacos in a town of a few hundred, which in West Texas means there are 2 places and both of them are the best. I said thanks, and she said, "Don't poke around the shafts. That ground remembers." And then she rolled on and left me with dust pebbles ticking down as they settled. I got to Terlingua at 5:49. The Starlight Theater had a cluster of tourists out front, the kind of late-season crowd that loses daylight, without knowing how quickly they're losing it. I idled past and found a spot near the old cemetery. A little wind stirred and the smell changed, a metallic note underneath the sun and sage, like pennies chewed in the back of your mouth. I locked the car and started up the low hill. The light stretched the shadows of crosses out like dark rungs. The graves were rough mounds, names hand-painted, dates sometimes nothing more than a year followed by a question mark. There were bottles, and toys and candles burned down to thumb-sized stubs. A small lizard ran across the path in front of me and stopped on a warm rock to blink at me, as if to say that everything out here was watching and that I'd better behave. That I grew up in a town where the dead were parked on velvet lawns. Here the dead lay under piled stones, and it felt truer. I stood at a grave with a tin plaque, and the name had blown away or peeled off in the sun, and a photograph, faded to a ghost of a face, stared blindly under fogged plastic. A rosary dangled and clicked in the wind. The high whine was still there. The metallic tang had gotten sharper. I thought of the fact I'd read in a hotel pamphlet in Alpine, that the miners who crushed cinnabar or to vapor and condensed mercury often absorbed enough of it that their teeth loosened and their lungs took on the industry like a debt, and they coughed up red grit as if the land were claiming late fees in blood. It wasn't a special moment. It wasn't cinematic. It was just me, sweating through my shirt and feeling the sun on the top of my head and the wind in my ears. But I heard a cough, a small, dry cough, like someone clearing their throat politely at a church service. It came from my right, from downslope, where the graves gave way to a wash full of rock and 2 stubborn acacia trees. I turned and squinted because the light was a blade through that direction. A man stood down there. He wore a long coat, the color of dirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. The coat looked heavy for the heat and old enough to have been hung on a nail at night for years. He was fixed in that way people fix when they visit the dead, one hand lightly on the top of a cross. The cross had a bit of ribbon tied to it, faded to the color of old blood. I lifted a hand to say hello. He didn't lift his. "Evening," I called. My voice felt too loud out there, pushed across to him like a thrown object. He turned his head, but not enough for me to see anything under that brim. The wind picked up and the ribbon clicked against the wood. He coughed again. It was the same cough. It made a little stirring of sound inside my own chest, like memory. "Sorry," I said, and I don't know why I apologized, except that his stillness made me feel like I had broken a rule. He lowered his head again, and I stepped back and walked up the hill toward the sea. At the top, I found a man sitting on the hood of a dusty white Toyota, watching the cemetery with a face like sunburnt leather and a gray beard softening and otherwise. Sharp jaw. He wore aviators and one of those sun hats with a flap down the back to guard the neck. He nodded at me as I came up. "You seen him?" he said. It wasn't a question, just a guy visiting a grave. "The coat. You seen him?" I looked back. The wash was empty. The ribbon on the cross fluttered like something breathing. He moved off. He'll move off when you look. He doesn't like to be watched. The man slid off his hood and stuck out a hand. "Name's Eddie. I tend to the place some. Pick up the beer cans. Tell folks to keep their dogs off the graves. They don't listen long." I shook his hand. It was hot and dry. He smelled like cigarette smoke and sunscreen. "I'm just passing through. Best way to be," he said. "You staying over?" He tilted his head toward town. "Starlight gets loud when the moon's up, but it's a friendly loud. I've got a room. One night." "Good," he said. He looked at the graves like they were people he had to consider before he spoke. "Weather's been tall. Dry? Even for here. The ground gets a voice when it wants water. Some folks hear it." I smiled because it felt like he was trying to spook me politely. "I heard the wind sing. That's one way to call it." He scratched his beard. "Don't walk the old mine when it's full dark. You can step on a crust and fall through, and nobody will find you till buzzards circle, and even then it'll be the bones that get counted." He said it kindly. "Eat, sleep, drive away in the morning. That's the arc. I'll do that." He looked at me for a second longer, and in the mirrored lenses I saw myself, dusty and smaller than I liked to think of myself being. "If you hear coughing," he said, and now he dropped his voice as if he were telling me who at the bar watered the drinks and who didn't. "Don't answer to it. There's old trouble. It's not always human trouble." He looked past me again to the wash, kept his face casual. "Have a good one, friend." I left him and drove down to the Starlight. I ate a burger that was better than it needed to be, and sat on the porch step afterward with a beer and watched the sky darken by degrees. Bats came out like thrown scraps of cloth, and the wind worked cooler fingers into the heat. A couple from Oklahoma told me they were doing the River Road tomorrow and asked if it was too much for their Subaru. I told them it would be fine as long as they didn't drive like they were trying to prove something to Texas. They laughed. Someone inside the bar sang a standard with a voice that had lived long and drank long and suffered just enough to sound like it meant IT, a T928. I walked back to my room, which was a little square of cool air behind a door that stuck on the threshold. The night smelled like dust and warm metal. A distant dog barked twice and then was shut up by somebody who wanted to keep their neighbors. I called my sister and told her I'd made it, and she warned me again about snakes as if snakes needed warning more than I did. I told her goodnight. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan and listened to the motel's humming and to something that might have been the breath of the desert, and then I slept that I woke just after 3 a.m. to the sound of coughing. It was in the room. It wasn't panicked or violent. It wasn't performative. It was small and dry and human and placed near the chair by the window. I sat up and the fan's shadow clawed the ceiling. My heart took 6 big beats inside my chest, and my mouth went thick the way it does when you dream of drinking water and wake to find that waking is the only thirst you get to quench. "Hello," I said. The words sounded dumb. I reached for the lamp and turned it on, and the room was the same as it had been. The chair had my shirt draped over it. The window unit rattled. The door was shut. The chain was slid. The deadbolt angled home. No one sat by the chair. Nothing moved. I told myself the sound had been outside, that the walls were thin and the distance made honest noises lie about their addresses. I got up and crossed the room. The carpet was rough and thin under my feet. I stood at the door and listened. The cough came again, from my right, which is to say from the bathroom or from the little closet or from nowhere places if you like that phrase. It was the exact same cough I had heard in the cemetery. The exact same weight and lack of weight. There was a slight rasp on the exhale at the end, like a fingernail dragged across dry wood that I stood for a minute with my heart banging and thought of Eddie telling me not to answer. I didn't say anything. I didn't call again. I went to the window and slid the curtain back 2 inches with a finger and looked out. The porch light made the gravel glow and showed the railing in splinters. Moths knocked politely at the bulb. Beyond the pool of light was a softer dark with shapes inside it that could have been trucks or hills or the kind of shadows your head makes when it wants to. And then a deeper dark beyond that where the stars cut holes in the sky. I stood there until the air in the room felt like it belonged to me again. When I got back into bed, I left the lamp on. I slept until 6:11 when the light outside had acquired color, and even then I was remembering the sound the way you remember a name you cannot pull from your mouth. I showered. The water ran rust-colored for a moment and then cleared. When I pulled my shirt from the chair, a fine red dust flaked down onto the carpet and disappeared into it the way a drop of blood would be eaten by a river. I told myself it was from walking the cemetery. I told myself the dust got everywhere. I told myself a lot of things that morning, like a man making change from a counter where the register has gone dead. T703. I checked out. The clerk, a tired woman with a migraine trying to climb through the left side of her face, asked if I had slept well, and I said sure. And I don't know why I lied to that stranger except for the superstition that telling certain truths at certain times gives them to other people like contagions. In the parking lot I coughed and didn't mean to, and it wasn't the same cough, and I let myself feel the relief of that. I drove back up to the cemetery because I do the thing you tell me not to do. I parked in the same spot. The sky was a cleaner blue than the day before. The wind was down. It was 78 degrees and warming. The high wine hung over the hill. The metallic smell was there, more like wet copper now. I walked up and stood at the gate and looked down at the wash and at the cross with the ribbon. The man in the coat wasn't there. Eddie was. He was crouched by one of the graves, pulling little weeds with slow fingers. He stood when he saw me and shaded his eyes and nodded. "You slept?" he said, and the way he said it made it sound like a brave act. I heard someone cough. He looked at my face for a half-second longer than politeness requires. "You didn't talk to it." I shook my head. It sounded like the same cough I heard yesterday. "Down there." He followed my eyes to the wash. "People come here to grieve all kind of things. Some of them are alive when they start. Sometimes the place grieves back. That sounds like the kind of thing tourists buy a t-shirt for. That's why I don't sell it," he said. He put his hands on his hips and blew air out through his nose. "That cough? We get it when the wind's right. Mercury does a number on a person." I watched my uncle get the shakes so bad he couldn't hold a spoon without it tapping Morse code on his coffee cup. He worked 4 years at the old mine, and the mine worked 30 on him after he left. "Is that what I heard?" Eddie shrugged. "You heard a sound. Don't put too much on a sound. It doesn't want the weight." "Who's buried by that ribbon cross?" "Conception R, 1911 to 1913. Pneumonia is what my granddad told me. The cough around here isn't always about the mine. Something about the way he said it pried under my ribs." "You believe me," I said, and I hadn't meant to say that, and now I never could unsay it. "I believe you heard a cough. I believe you don't want to think about what happens if you start answering voices that aren't attached to anyone you can see." He pointed to the ground near my shoes. "You picked up dust." I looked down. On the toe of my right boot, smeared like thumb paint, was a pale red streak. Not rust red, more like brick ground to a powder. My boots were tan leather and they had dust on them, but this was different. I rubbed my boots together and the streak fell in a flake. "I'm not a mystic," I said, as if anyone had accused me of that, as if anyone cared. "Good," Eddie said. "Mystics die pretty fast out here, or else they get famous enough they move to Santa Fe. Either way, they quit being neighborly. Go take your drive. The river is good for a man whether or not he puts his feet in it." I left the cemetery and drove FM 170 toward Lajitas, the river road, which I recommend even now with whatever I have learned. The road winds like a ribbon dropped casually by a god with somewhere else to be. There were times I saw the Rio Grande lay itself down in the sunlight like a living snake that had decided to nap. The mountains wore shadows with seriousness. I pulled off and stood at an overlook and felt the wind come up from the gorge and run through the hair on my arms like a hand. I did not hear coughing. I did not think about mines. I let the land do its best trick, which is to consider you until the part of you that thinks it is the center of your story learns better. I took photos. I drank water like it was holy. I drove back toward Terlingua in the early afternoon, a different route, a well-graded dirt road that paralleled the highway. It wasn't marked as private, and the tire tracks told me I wasn't the only one who had taken it. The map on my phone had opinions, but we were out of service by then, and I prefer a map that keeps some of my secrets. The road brought me past scattered trailers and the occasional house with a yard made of old appliances and pride. It also took me past the skeleton of a building that leaned like a sighing man. Corrugated tin roofing clung to it like scabbed skin. A sign long ago painted had become a white rectangle surrendering to the sun. There was a metal cistern squatting nearby and a scatter of rusted pails and pans. I don't know why I stopped. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't photogenic in the way ruin can be. It was just orphaned, and the day had room for orphans that I put the car in park and left it running because that is a thing I do when I stop somewhere I haven't decided how I feel about. The wind had dropped further. It was very quiet. I could hear the small noises my car made as it cooled. A fly found me and then got bored. There was a smell that had nothing to do with creosote or mesquite or the petrochemical ghost that always seems to ride on a highway. It was that metallic smell again, more insistent now, and laced with something like old lemon cleaner. It made a memory in me of my grandmother's house and the way she had disinfected grief after my grandfather died, and the two smells got mixed. Up for me forever after. There was a piece of shadow under what had been the kitchen. I stood in it and let my eyes adjust and saw a basin set on a wood crate. The basin had a hairline crack that meandered across like a dry riverbed. Inside the basin was a stain that was not dust. It was dried in a mindless geography, but the color had not faded entirely. I reached toward it before I knew what I was doing and stopped when I saw my hand hovering over it like a thing that did not belong to me. I stepped back. There was a sharp tick as something in the roof adjusted to the heat, and then another as if the house itself were remembering to breathe. "Don't," someone said behind me. That I turned fast and caught the edge of the door frame with my shoulder. And pain pinned me for a second, so completely I forgot what startle was for. Then Eddie stood in the doorway, hat off, hair plastered to his skull with sweat, and in his hand a bottle of Gatorade the color of antifreeze. He took me in, my posture. My idiot hand held like a supplicant over a basin. "You don't want to touch anything that held someone else's misery," he said. "That stuff doesn't dry." I lowered my hand. "It's not your place," I said, because something about being ordered makes me say dumb things. "No," he said, and he leaned his shoulder against the door and considered me the way you consider a man about to try to jump a fence he cannot clear. "It's not anyone's place now. That's the problem. How'd you find me?" "I tend to the place," he said again, which was not an answer, but was the only answer he liked to give. "You want to stand in the sun a spell? This house smells like remembering." I joined him outside. The heat met me like an argument. He handed me his Gatorade and I swallowed twice and handed it back without wiping the bottle, because he was right that certain manners stop making sense in certain places. "Who lived here?" I asked. "Family named Rivas," he said. "Then a man named Tully for a while, though he didn't live so much as convalesce. He came out for his lungs. Desert's supposed to be good for people who wheeze. He lasted a year, left like a spider, crawled out of his chest, and took his breath with it. After that, nobody, except for the things that don't need water." "What's in the basin?" "Somebody tried to doctor somebody," he said. "Bleeding and all that. People brought old beliefs out here and found out the land had older ones. You can feel it, can't you? The way the place wears a body like a borrowed coat." I stood silently. The wind carried a faint smell with it again, that copper. Eddie squinted down at my hands. "You got dust on you," he said. "I've got dust in me," I said, because that's what it felt like. "That too." He pointed at my car. "Your back left tire looks soft. You ought to fix that in town. Don't be the man who learns what 50 miles on a rim buys him." I looked and he was right. The tire bulged a bit. I hadn't felt the car pull yet, which scared me more than if I had. I told him thank you. He stared at the house for a minute like a man watching a TV show he always hated but kept watching anyway. "There's a thing," he said. "You should know it before you start hearing things you'll be tempted to help. We had a doctor here, not the company doctor. Before that, he rode down from Marathon once a month in 1908, then again in 1909 when the rain failed. He had a black bag and a mind full of books and a wife who took photographs of funeral parties like they were cash. He moved here for a year when the fevers took a road through the town. He slept behind the store. He was a decent man by all accounts. which is a thing people say when they don't have a better story. People died anyway. That's how this place tells time. He died walking up from the wash. One step and down like a man kneeling, but not to pray. Heart or heat or both. They buried him with the others, and I have a suspicion that he didn't accept the terms. You hear the cough, you don't answer. Every helper becomes a ghost if you don't watch your step. Is that him I saw? Eddie shrugged. That coat wasn't his. The coat is something the place puts on. You start knowing the difference, and you have a chance. He left me then, which is to say he got in his truck and drove away and made me feel like I was the one left in the wrong place. I watched his taillights kick dust, and then the dust eat the light, and then I went to my car and nudged the tire and felt it give and drove carefully into town and paid a man named Conrado to patch it. Conrado told me he'd seen worse, but had me promised to buy 4 new tires in the next 6 months if I planned to keep living in a state that pretends to be 2 states stapled together that I decided then, though I didn't admit it to myself as a decision, to leave that afternoon instead of the next morning. Terlingua is beautiful, but beauty can be tiring if it keeps you afraid of your own shadow. I packed my bag and reloaded the car in a way that felt like defense. I told the clerk, a different woman this time with the energy of someone who talks to strangers all day and reserves the rest of herself for people who have earned it, that I had to go, and she said safe travels. The motel cat watched me from the shade with the bored suspicion cats always manage. As I opened the door, the smell hit me again, a slap of copper. I turned and expected to see someone standing on the far side of my car, someone bleeding, or someone roasting meat, or someone pulling a prank they shouldn't enjoy, but there was no one. There were 2 crushed beer cans by the curb and cigarette filters dried into tooth-sized bones. Everything else was the country fulfilling its contract with the sun that I started the engine and the radio came on, which I didn't remember leaving it on. Static, then a station hissing from some far side. A woman laughing at a joke that came through as a series of shapes, all consonants and no vowels. I pressed seek and the readout stuttered and landed on 88.3 FM, a station that didn't exist by my app, which I couldn't check anyway, but there it was. There was a rustle and then a man's voice. Not a DJ. You know how DJs sound like they want you to be just a hair happier than you already are. This voice sounded like someone leaning in without moving closer. If you're sick, the voice said, you should take the air. The words weren't the strange part. The strange part was how they were exactly between my ears and nowhere else in the car. The strange part was that I knew the moment he finished that I should not reply. How do you reply to a radio? How do you reply to breath? I pressed seek and it pinned me still to 88.3 and the voice said again, like he had heard me try to leave, I am headed up to see the doctor. And then he coughed, that dry small cough with the rasp at the end, like a fingernail on wood. I turned the radio off and the car felt like it exhaled. This is nothing, I told myself, and I said it aloud and my voice didn't quite make it to the edges of the car. I drove out of the lot and up the road and kept my eyes on the painted line because it is a thing you can trust when other things start to lie. A truck came the other way and the driver lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in the universal West Texas greeting, and I lifted mine back, and I wanted to ask him if he heard anything strange, and I wanted to be the man who doesn't stop strangers. To borrow their courage. Past the cemetery, the road dips and climbs, and then opens toward the ridge that gives you a view south. On the long shoulder on the right, at a place where an old cattle guard has been removed and left a square of habit. In the earth, I saw him. The long coat, the hat, the head bent slightly to say I know I am being watched, and I will not reward your eyes. He stood not quite in the shadow of a telephone pole. He lifted his right hand as I drew even, and I saw the hand was wrong. It was not flesh-colored the way hands are when they belong to the world. It was a shade paler than his coat, and the texture was silt. He made a small motion, not a wave, not quite a beckoning, and dipped his head further. He coughed. My tires sang over the asphalt, and the echo hit me a half-second later because the land gives you your sounds back when it thinks you have earned them. I did not stop. I should tell you that I almost did. I should tell you that my foot lifted. Fractionally, that my right hand shifted on the wheel like it wanted to go to the turn signal by itself. I should tell you that I felt a deep, throat-level guilt, as if I were driving past a man on the side of the road in winter who wanted a ride into town, and I had decided that kindness belongs to people who look like me. But I did not stop. I kept driving. I told myself I had a slow leak in a tire and I had miles to go. At the last bend before the highway, I checked my rear view. There was a heat shimmer. The pole was a stick in the air. The shoulder was empty. It would have been a fine magic trick if I had believed in magic more than I believe in ordinary mistakes. I made Van Horn that evening and took a room at a motel that smelled like bleach that hadn't quite fought off its enemies. I ate at a diner with a laminated menu and talked to a waitress with a tattoo of the Virgin Mary on her bicep that looked at me sternly while she asked what kind of pie I wanted. I laughed too much at a bad joke a man at the counter told because laughing makes you easier to be around. I tipped well. When I lay down in the room, the TV remote heavy in my hand, I was tired, the real fatigue that comes from heat and miles, and the slow, careful work of setting your nerves down and keeping your hands open. I woke at 2:19 to the sound of coughing. It came from the bathroom. It came from inside the old plastic exhaust fan that whirred itself to death for 20 minutes after you flipped the switch. The room was dark because I had decided an hour before that I had a better chance at the kind of sleep that doesn't ask questions if I didn't leave a light on. I reached the lamp and turned it on, and the cough came again, and the fan did not. Or because I had not turned it on. I said nothing. I got out of bed. I stood in the carpet pile by the bathroom door. The tile was chipped, and the sink had a scratch that looked like a dark vein through porcelain. The mirror had a spot where the silvering had died, and the motel had decided to ignore its own reflection. The scratch in the sink had red dust gathered in it. I stared at it because that kind of detail is the kind of thing I become stupid with. I want to be reasonable, you understand. I want to file things under ordinary. I want to sort them into natural, misheard, coincidence, trick of the light. Red dust in a sink 170 miles from where you saw red dust fall off your own shirt is not ordinary. Not even when you try to be generous with ordinary. But I was not ready to make a new category that I turned the tap and the water came out with a cough of its own and ran clear and washed the red into the bowl, and I took a cheap hotel cup and filled it and drank and told my body I had done something practical, and that was the kind of food it would get. The cough came again from the fan. It was the same cough every time. The way a recording is the same, except it wasn't a recording, and I knew that because it didn't fall exactly the same on my ear, but it fell exactly the same on some other part of me. The part that knows where the steps in a childhood house creak. I turned on the fan. The blade spun and the cough stopped. I stood for too long listening to the fan because I wanted to pretend cause and effect had waited for me like a bus. I turned off the fan. The room was the sound of the air conditioner and the highway and my own breath. I said aloud, "I'm leaving in the morning," and the room did not argue that I did not sleep much. At 6:31 I was on the road, moving east again because home had gravity. The tire held. The radio stayed off. Midway between Sierra Blanca and Fort Hancock, where the land looks like a sea that forgot it was supposed to have water, I passed a white cross on the side of the highway with a fresh bouquet tied to it. I do not know why people think flowers last longer in heat if they are bound to grief, but I like to think the dead appreciate the gesture even if they don't need the bouquet. Itself. At and Exxon in Fort Stockton, I put gas in the car and bought coffee that smelled like it wanted to be remembered as better than it tasted. A man at the next pump coughed hard enough that he leaned on his truck, and I turned my head and said, "You all right?" And he nodded and said allergies, and I laughed through my nose because it was a word that made sense in the world that had sense. Left. I got back in the car and set my cup down and pressed the radio's button because sometimes you poke a bruise to make sure it still hurts, and the dial found 88.3 right away. The red line on the display went there like a habit. Static filled the car like foam, then cleared, and the voice said, softer now, more as if it had made a concession. I went up to the doctor, but he was not there, and it's a far way to my house. When my chest hurts, I turned the radio off. I didn't throw it. I didn't panic. I drove. I watched the temperature climb from 82 to 90 to 96. I heard a low whistle through a gasket in the driver's window that I hadn't heard before, and it gave me a rhythm, and I told myself I could keep time with the whistle and forget the other sound that I didn't go straight home. I stopped in Ozona at a rest area with a stone pavilion and feral peacocks, and I sat at a table and listened to a family argue about whether Doritos counted as lunch. The normalcy moved across my skin like balm. I drove on and through the hill country where the green came back to the edges of things and shade reappeared. The road was busier. The sky had clouded around the edges with summer thunderheads daydreaming about being storms. I pulled into my apartment lot at 3:20 in the afternoon, 8 hours before I had planned. The neighbor's kid was spraying ants with a hose. The smell of barbecue fire drifted from 2 buildings over. The world had put itself back on. I carried my bag up the stairs. When I set it down, dust spilled from the zipper as if I had been traveling with flour. There was red balanced on the narrow edge of the hall table where you set your keys. I looked at it and thought how easy it would be to say it was from a construction site or from clay tracked on someone's boot, except that it didn't look like clay or brick. It looked like what it was. It looked like ground-up rock that had held the promise of mercury. I vacuumed. I showered. The water was clear, and then it wasn't, briefly, and then it was again. I had seen that trick before in old pipes. I told myself the pipes in my building were old enough to do tricks. When I got out, there was a fog patch on the mirror, and in it a place where the mirror had stayed dry. An oval the shape of a face. I wiped it away, and my reflection looked more tired than I wanted and older than I had felt, and behind me there was only shower tile and no one wearing a hat. The first night back, I slept with the radio on the dresser. Cord unplugged, because that is the kind of joke you make when fear has to be turned into a toy. I woke at 1:17, and the cord was plugged into the wall. The radio was off. The room was full of a silence that had a shape in it, like a person standing perfectly still in a closet. I sat up, and the headboard sighed against the wall. In the hall, a cough. Not the neighbor, not a person you could assign to the sound. Without lying, I stood and opened the bedroom door, and the cough did not come again, and that is when I understood something I had not wanted to understand. The cough was not a call to help. The cough was a way of hearing where you were and if you were listening. There are people who will not know what I mean. There are people who will. If a thing needs to find you, it asks politely first. It teaches your ear, and once you have learned the shape of the sound, you teach it where you are, the way you call a dog by saying its name each day until it knows that its name is itself. The days after that slid. I went to work. I spoke to people. I sent emails with subjects that could have been prayers. I stood in the break room and laughed and asked a woman with bandages on her forearms how she had burned herself, and she said the oven rack got her, and I nodded and felt that small other piece of me ask what shape that burn was, what depth, what tint, and I hated myself a little for a second for having curiosity trained by a thing that had nothing to do with me. At night, the cough once. Not every night. If it had been every night, it might have lost its power. Enough nights that I started to time my breath so that I wouldn't be breathing in when it happened. It was always there and not there. It was always the same, and the way it sat in my ear was a lever. A week in, I found small red crescents under my fingernails when I woke. I don't bite my nails. I don't keep soil under my bed. I wash my hands and watch the red smear and vanish. And feel that same ugly relief as when you cancel the dentist appointment you should probably keep. I made coffee and took 2 sips, and then saw a hairline crack in my favorite mug that had not been there the day before. It ran from lip to base like a fault line. I threw the mug away and then took it back out of the trash because throwing away your favorite mug is the kind of thing grief makes you do, and I was angry at the idea that grief was a thing I should be entertaining when no one had died. I stopped listening to the radio. I played music through Bluetooth. I put white noise on my phone, and then the phone updated itself at 2 in the morning, and the white noise went quiet, and the cough came once, and I lay there with my hands on my chest feeling whether any of me was occupied by a tenant I had not least space to. I dreamed. Not every night. In the dreams, I am walking up from the wash, and my feet feel very heavy, but not like feet in mud. Heavy like feet falling through many layers of screen door mesh laid over a hole, the way a body would. Step through paper floors, the way you would never feel safe on any surface again. In the dream, the sunlight is too bright, and a man is standing ahead of me with a black doctor's bag, the kind with the mouth that opens like an animal's, and he is kind and tired, and I love him. I love him with the same love you hold for a stranger who has the thing that fixes you. And then he is not there, and my mouth tastes like a penny. I started sleeping on the couch because the couch is nearer the front door, and the front door felt like an answer. If something inside is suffocating you, why not move nearer the edge of the place where you could still run? Twice I woke to find the chain on the door undone and the deadbolt unlocked. I started setting a chair under the knob like my grandmother did in a house with more men than she wanted in it. In the morning, the chair would be moved a half inch and not more, and that is how you go insane politely. That is how a thing teaches you to corrupt your measurement. A month after I left Terlingua, I saw Eddie again. Not in person, on my phone, in a photograph threaded through the local paper's website. There had been a collapse up at one of the old shafts. Two geology students out past their caution had punched through a crust and dropped 10 feet, and one of them had broken a leg and the other had wrapped a belt around his thigh because he had seen it in a movie, and a cell signal had climbed a hill and a call had been made, and the volunteer fire department had earned their keep. The photograph was the students on a stretcher, and behind them a man in a hat you could call a cowboy hat if you didn't know any better, and he had a gray beard and a face like leather softened with kindness, and there was dust on him, red dust. And I could not tell my heart to calm down looking at him, because calm would have been a lie. The caption used his name. It said he had been the first to hear the ground go strange and had flagged the crew. I sent the photograph to my sister and told her this is the man I told you about who told me to avoid bad holes, and she texted back, "Be nice, he might save you one day," and I wanted to ask her who saves the savers, and I didn't because I knew what answer I would get. That night the cough came twice. I sat up on the couch, and the air in the apartment felt slow. I got up and walked to the kitchen to drink water, and there was a sound like a foot dragging. Not a heavy foot, not the sound of someone breaking in. The sound of a shoe scuffing lightly across a floor the way a person does who doesn't want to bother you, but needs to be near. My kitchen is small, and the refrigerator light is bright and mean at 2:30 in the morning. I set the glass on the counter and took a breath and said to the empty air toward the closet in my hall, the place that always looks darker than the rest, "I cannot help you. I cannot be the thing you need. IT is hard to explain, but there is a part of you designed to make any voice in a room outside of your own feel like a duty. Call it childhood training. Call it animal instinct. When someone coughs, you fill a glass and bring it to them. When someone says doctor, you look up directions, even if you know the clinic is closed." That part of me went silent for a second. I had starved it since May 20th, and it had not liked the diet, and it had sulked. But in that second, the apartment shifted the way a sleeping dog shifts, and then there was less weight. I stood there with my hands on the counter, and I did not cry. I did not cry because there was more. The red returned. It returned in odd corners, in the swale of the bookshelf where a spine had kept dust from making contact. It returned under the lip of the windowsill like lipstick rubbed into a napkin. It returned in the cuff of my jeans. I stopped trying to clean it more than once a week because you can lose everything scrubbing and still not get nothing. I started running a box fan at night because the noise filled the room better than my thoughts. I stopped telling friends why I was tired in August. I got a postcard from my sister. She had taken my teasing and driven west with her husband and had done the normal version of the trip I had done. The postcard had a photo of the Marfa Lights viewing area on the front. On the back, she had written saw nothing but stars and men, making up stories about them, and it was perfect, and I laughed because that is the right reaction when someone has the life you should have had. There was a PS. "Your man Eddie says hi. He told us about people falling in and how to not be idiots. He had a cough." She circled that word with a pen and drew a tiny heart because she likes men with hero energy, and I did not love her for that. In the moment that I called her, she said they had stopped for gas and he had been there at the next pump and they had recognized him, and he had told them a story about how the ground talks and how to listen without obeying. She said he had coughed the whole time. She said he was fine and that it was the dust and the season and his age, and that in winter he was a new man. She laughed and said she told him to try honey. I did not know how to say how wrong. Honey fell in my mouth in that moment. In September, I woke to a sound in the wall. A tiny scrape. A tiny click. I lay there listening and decided I had mice. It was almost a relief. I could buy traps. I could call the landlord. I could apply cause and effect like a bomb. I bought traps. I set them. In the morning, the peanut butter bait was untouched, and there were smears of red on the baseboard at a point where the wall had bubbled slightly from an old leak. I scraped at the smear, and it came up like dust, and then stuck to the tip of my finger, and I wiped my hand on my jeans and thought, this is an absurdity I am participating in. I thought I would like to be the kind of man who calls a priest. I am not that kind of man. I drove west again in October. Don't ask me why. Because if you don't walk into a thing, you will spend the rest of your life walking around it. Because there is a part of me that believes in finishing a conversation, even if it was never mine to begin. Because I wanted to see if the cough would shut up if I brought it to its origin like a snake in a pillowcase that I left on a Friday at 8:03 a.m. with the sky stained pink and the forecast dry. I brought water. I brought money. I brought the version of myself that pretends to be practical. I checked into the same motel because I wanted the continuity. The clerk said welcome back as if I were a valued customer, and I felt like a criminal buying my own trouble that I drove to the cemetery at dusk because if I am going to do a thing, I will at least do it when it looks like itself. I parked where I had parked. I walked up the hill. The wind was lower than the previous year. The wine was there and stronger. The metallic smell was here as if it had never left, as if it had sat on a rock waiting for me with the patience only weather has. There were candles stuck in the ground at 2 graves where there hadn't been candles before. The ribbon on the cross down in the wash was more faded. It looked like blood that had been left in the sun to bleach into history. Eddie was not there. A woman with a camera and a wide-brimmed hat that advertised a brewery in Austin took photos of her boyfriend by the graves, and he laughed in the way men laugh when they want to pretend they feel at ease in places that have no patience for pretending. I stood by the gate and watched the wash because I didn't know where else to look. At 6:12 p.m. the sun touched the edge of a low hill, and the shadow of the gate stretched off like a dark road, and a cough came from the bottom of that road. The man in the coat rose out of the wash like the shadow of a man stepping away from a taller shadow. He stood with his hand on the ribbon cross, and he lifted his head enough that I could see under the brim. I saw nothing. Not a face of absence. Not a blank. A smear of red. Not fluid. Not blood. Dust in the shape of a man's face standing where a face should be. I wanted to say I am not here for you. I wanted to say I cannot help. I wanted to say I am sorry. What came out of my mouth was a name that I do not know the name. I cannot write it because I cannot hold it. It was not in English. It was not in Spanish. It was a shape my mouth made because my mouth had heard it before. When I said it, the wind shook the weedy grasses and the candles downslope went flat. The woman with the camera looked at me and then back to her screen and said to her boyfriend, "Did you hear thunder?" The man in the coat tilted his head and stepped once toward me. That was all. A single soft step that did not scuff gravel. Then he stopped because Eddie walked into the cemetery from the far side and raised his hand the way you would raise it to a dog that belongs to you, or the way you would raise it to a stranger who is about to step into your lane. "Evening," he said, and he said it like a prayer gets said when a man isn't sure who he is praying to. "Friend, close your mouth." I closed my mouth. The man in the coat lowered his head like he had done what he needed. He laid his hand back on the cross with the ribbon. He coughed. He did not vanish. That would have been a trick. He stood there until the sun had gone low. Enough that the wash was a plate of shadow, and then the shadow was a wall, and then what I was looking at was a trick my eyes could play on me, and I turned to Eddie, and he was looking at me with a sadness so deep it felt like I was falling into it. "You answered," he said. I said a name. "I don't know why. You don't need to know why to have done it." He came close enough to touch me and did not touch me. "You might be fine," he said. "You might be bone stupid. I have been both. The desert loves both. It eats both like candy. How do I undo it? You can't undo it. Undoing isn't a thing we get. You can be still. You can be quiet. That's it." "Who is he?" "Do you want the story?" Eddie said, and he squinted into the wash as if someone had written a thing down there very small, and he was trying to make it out. "We had a man here who breathed dust until dust had the right to call itself human. Inside him, he walked this way for a doctor with a bag. He didn't make it. He has a way of practicing. He says the name of his road by coughing it. The name of his door is your attention." The couple had wandered off. The candles guttered back to life. The first star showed in the east, one eye open. The wind rose and then dropped. I felt very tender, the way you feel the morning after you have convinced your body to vomit up something that would have destroyed you if you had kept it. "I thought he was asking for help," I said. "He is," Eddie said. "He wants you to help him be here. That's all any of them want." He bowed his head slightly, not to me, to the graves. "You should go home before you're homesick for a place you can't live in." I left. I tried to say goodbye to him, and he had already gone the direction he always goes, out into the country where the work he has made for himself waits for him. I drove back to the motel, and there were people sitting outside their rooms smoking and talking about a mountain lion they had not seen, and I laughed with them because the easiest way to forgive the world is to make your mouth your most agreeable feature. I went inside. I locked the door. I slept for an hour and then woke at 12:07 to the cough inside the wall behind the headboard. I said nothing. At 1:13 it came again, and I said nothing. At 2:22 something tapped very gently on the window, and I looked, and there was dust on the glass and a smear that had not been there, a shape like a palm, 5 fingers and a web between them. Not quite right, a glove made of ground stone. I sat in the chair by the window, and I put my head in my hands, and I thought of the doctor's bag, and the radio, and the basin, and Eddie, and the way the desert uses people to hear itself. In the morning I checked out, and the clerk was the same. Woman with the migraine, and this time her face was clear, and she smiled without parting her lips. She said, "Drive safe." I said, "You too," which is a dumb thing to say to a person who is not going to drive. I drank coffee at the bar with open windows and watched a cat that might have been the motel cat or might have been its cousin watch a fly and then make a decision not to bother. I walked out into the sun and felt small joy when a gust of wind hit me because I felt for a second like a man without an appointment. I started the car. The radio, plugged in or not, on or not, is a thing that has meaning now. I don't know who made that meaning. I don't know if I helped. I drove away and I said the word home under my breath once like a charm. I wish the end were clean. I wish the lesson were something I could write down and hand you, and you could put it in your pocket and then leave it in the wash with tokens for the dead. The end is not clean. The end is like the beginning. On Tuesday, October 19th, at 11:58 p.m., in my apartment 100 leagues from Terlingua, I woke to the cough and said nothing, and the cough came again, and I said nothing. And then my phone lit up on the coffee table with a number I did not know. I watched it vibrate, its jittery little dance, and then go still. It rang again. I answered because I am still human, and someone calling you at midnight is duty calling no matter how much desert you have in your head. The line was empty at first, and then there was the faint sound of someone breathing as if they had learned, by copying the sound abstractly, not as if they had a chest. Then the cough. Then the voice like leather drying in the sun, worn through in the places where hope used to live, said, "I'm heading up to see the doctor, and it is a far way, and my chest hurts, and can I sit a minute in your shade?" He did not ask my name. He did not have to. I sat with the phone to my ear and thought of Eddie raising his hand, telling the world no with the gentleness you reserve for a good dog. I said no. I said, "You cannot sit here." I said, "I am not a doctor, and I am not your house, and I am not your grave," and the breathing did not change, and then the line went dead. I slept a bit, I think. In the morning there was red dust on the mat by my front door and the print of a boot that was too long and too narrow and wrong in one way that made me question all the ways I had decided what was right. I swept it. I did not open the door for anyone that day. If there is advice embedded in this, it is small and not noble. In places where people have died asking the air for relief, do not pretend you can be the thing that fixes what the land broke. In places where the ground remembers names, do not give it yours. In places where the wind brings breath to your ear that does not belong to a body, be still. Be quiet. Do not oblige the dead with the yes in your voice. Let them be what they are without your help. You do not know what your help cost. I write this at 9:04 on a Sunday. The sky over my parking lot is a pale August white, and a boy in a yellow shirt is shouting at his mother in the language of little tyrants, and a bus breaks in size, and under it there is a sound I will tell myself is the air conditioning in the hallway, or the pipes settling, or the old building deciding once more it will tolerate its tenants for another season. It is a cough. If you lean to listen, you can hear how polite it is. You can hear how easily you might answer. You can hear in it how a place, even one that is not a desert, can put on the shape of a man and lean toward your shade and ask to sit. Sometimes a thing knocks because it wants to come in. Sometimes it knocks because it wants to learn your door. I have stopped opening mine. The dust gathers along the sill anyway. I sweep. I sleep with a fan. When the radio at 88.3 wakes itself and describes a road I have driven, I do not speak. A week ago I dreamed of Eddie standing in my kitchen, hat off, looking tired and patient and older than a graveyard. And he raised his hand the way he does, and his face was kind, and his beard was gray, and there was red dust in it that looked like a joke the desert had made, and he said, "Friend, stay where you are." And then he coughed, just once, a dry cough with a rasp at the end like a fingernail dragged across dry wood, and I woke up with my hand on the radio's plug in the dark. If you think this is a story with an ending, you have not lived in a place that teaches you to count breaths like beads. If you go west, if you stand in Terlingua under that hard white coin of a sun and smell pennies and hear a polite sound at your right hand, put your tongue to the roof of your mouth and keep it there and swallow and say nothing. When you come home, if you hear it again, If the radio thinks for you, if your mirror hoards fog in shapes that aren't your face, do not. Let pity undo you. I promise you that kindness has teeth in places that don't get rained on. I tell myself it is only a sound. I tell myself it is weather, which is memory, which is the land rehearsing breath long after the body that made it has given up. I tell myself a lot of things. Last night, a single print in red on the kitchen linoleum half a step from the sink. Pointed toward the hall, narrow and long, not quite right. I cleaned it. This morning there is a smear on the radio's dial at 88.3 and a tick in the wall when I hold my breath and the smallest cough inside the fan's hum when it cycles down. After I switch it off. If I ignore it, if I keep my mouth shut, it waits, patient as rock. If I answer, even to tell it no, even to tell it I am not a doctor, it quickens, it warms the air, it finds the places where dust is allowed in, and it makes them doors. I have learned the shape of the sound. The sound has learned me. And that, I think, is the thing I cannot sweep up.